Chapter 26 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 26. 1. As he walked through the train looking for familiar faces, he saw only one person whom he knew, and that was Seneca Doane, the lawyer who, after the blessings of being in Babbitt's own class at college and of becoming corporation counsel, had turned crank, had headed farmer labor tickets, and fraternized with admitted socialists. Though he was in rebellion naturally, Babbitt did not care to be seen talking with such a fanatic. But in all the Pullmans he could find no other acquaintance, and reluctantly halted. Seneca Doane was a slight, thin-haired man, rather like Chum Frink, except that he hadn't Frink's grin. He was reading a book called The Way of All Flesh. It looked religious to Babbitt, and he wondered if Doane could possibly have been converted and turned decent and patriotic. "Why, hello, Doane," he said. Doane looked up. His voice was curiously kind. "Oh, how do, Babbitt." "Been away, eh?" "Yes, I have been in Washington." "Washington, eh? How's the old government making out?" "It's— Won't you sit down?" "Thanks. Don't care if I do. Well, been quite a while since I had a good chance to talk to you, Doane. I was sorry you didn't turn up at the last class dinner." "Oh, thanks." "How's the unions coming? Going to run for mayor again?" Doane seemed restless. He was fingering the pages of his book. He said, "I might," as though it didn't mean anything in particular, and he smiled. Babbitt liked that smile and hunted for conversation. "Saw a bang-up cabaret in New York, the Good Morning Cutie Bunch, at Hotel Minton." "Yes, they're pretty girls. I danced there one evening." "Oh, like dancing?" "Naturally. I like dancing and pretty women and good food better than anything else in the world. Most men do." "By gosh, Doane, I thought you fellows wanted to take all the good eats and everything away from us." "No, not at all. What I'd like to see is the meetings of the garment workers held at the Ritz, with a dance afterwards. Isn't that reasonable?" "It might be a good idea, all right. Well, shame I haven't seen more of you recent years. Oh, say, I hope you haven't held it against me, my bucking you as mayor, going on the stump for Prout. You see, I'm an organization Republican, and I kind of felt—" "There's no reason why you shouldn't fight me. I have no doubt you're good for the organization. I remember in college you were an unusually liberal, sensitive chap. I can still recall your saying to me that you were going to be a lawyer and take the cases of the poor for nothing, and fight the rich. And I remember I said I was going to be one of the rich myself, and buy paintings and live at Newport. I'm sure you inspired us all." Well, I've always aimed to be liberal." Babbitt was enormously shy and proud and self-conscious. He tried to look like the boy he had been a quarter-century ago, and he shone upon his old friend Seneca Doane as he rumbled, "Trouble with a lot of these fellows, even the live wires and some of 'em that think they're forward-looking, is they aren't broad-minded and liberal. Now, I always believe in giving the other fellow a chance and listening to his ideas." "That's fine." "Tell you how I figure it. A little opposition is good for all of us, so a fellow, especially if he's a business man and engaged in doing the work of the world, ought to be liberal." "Yes?" "I always say a fellow ought to have vision and ideals. I guess some of the fellows in my business think I'm pretty visionary, but I just let 'em think what they want to think and go right on, same as you do." "By golly, it's nice to sit and visit and kind of, you might say, brush up on our ideals." "But of course the visionaries do rather get beaten. Doesn't it bother you?" "Not a bit. Nobody can dictate to me what I think." "You're the man. I want you to help me. I want you to talk to some of the businessmen and try to make them a little more liberal in their attitude towards poor Beecher Ingram." "Ingram? But why, he's this nut preacher that got kicked out of the Congregational Church, isn't he? And preaches free love and sedition?" This, Doane explained, was indeed the general concept of Beecher Ingram, but he himself saw Beecher Ingram as a priest of the brotherhood of man, of which Babbitt was notoriously an upholder. So would Babbitt keep his acquaintances from hounding Ingram and his forlorn little church? "You bet. I'll call down any of the boys I hear getting funny about Ingram," Babbitt said affectionately to his dear friend Doane. Doane warmed up and became reminiscent. He spoke of student days in Germany, of lobbying for single tax in Washington, of international labor conferences. He mentioned his friends, Lord Wycombe, Colonel Wedgwood, Professor Piccoli. Babbitt had always supposed that Doane associated only with the I.W.W., but now he nodded gravely, as one who knew Lord Wycombes by the score, and he got two references to Sir Gerald Doak. He felt daring and idealistic and cosmopolitan. Suddenly, in his new spiritual grandeur, he was sorry for Zilla Riesling, and understood her as those ordinary fellows at the Booster Club never could. 2. 5 hours after he had arrived in Zenith, he told his wife how hot it was in New York. He went to call on Zilla. He was buzzing with ideas and forgiveness. He'd get Paul released. He'd do things, vague but highly benevolent things, for Zilla. He'd be as generous as his friend Seneca Doane. He had not seen Zilla since Paul had shot her, and he still pictured her as buxom, high-colored, lively, and a little blowsy. As he drove up to her boarding-house in a depressing back street below the wholesale district, he stopped in discomfort. At an upper window, leaning on her elbows, was a woman with the features of Zilla, but she was bloodless and aged, like a yellow wad of old paper crumpled into wrinkles. Where Zilla had bounded and jiggled, this woman was dreadfully still. He waited half an hour before she came into the boarding-house parlor. 50 times he opened the book of photographs of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. 50 times he looked at the picture of the Court of Honor. He was startled to find Zilla in the room. She wore a black, streaky gown, which she had tried to brighten with a girdle of crimson ribbon. The ribbon had been torn and patiently mended. He noted this carefully, because he did not wish to look at her shoulders. One shoulder was lower than the other. One arm she carried in contorted fashion as though it were paralyzed, and behind a high collar of cheap lace there was a gouge in the anemic neck, which had once been shining and softly plump. "Yes," she said. "Well, well, old Zilla, by golly, it's good to see you again." He can send his messages through a lawyer. "Why, rats, Zilla, I didn't come here just because of him. Came as an old friend." "You waited long enough." "Well, you know how it is. Figured you wouldn't want to see a friend of his for quite some time, and sit down, honey. Let's be sensible. We've all of us done a bunch of things that we hadn't ought to, but maybe we can sort of start over again. Honest, Zilla, I'd like to do something to make you both happy. Know what I thought today? Mind you, Paul doesn't know a thing about this. Doesn't know I was going to come to see you. I got to thinking, Zilla's a fine, big-hearted woman, and she'll understand that Paul had his lesson now. Why wouldn't it be a fine idea if you asked the governor to pardon him? Believe he would if it came from you. No, wait. Just think how good you'd feel if you were generous." "Yes, I wish to be generous." She was sitting primly, speaking icily. "For that reason I wish to keep him in prison as an example to evil doers. I've gotten religion, George, since the terrible thing that man did to me. Sometimes I used to be unkind, and I wished for worldly pleasures, for dancing in the theater. But when I was in the hospital, the pastor of the Pentecostal Communion Faith used to come to see me, and he showed me, right from the prophecies written in the Word of God, that the day of judgment is coming, and all the members of the older churches are going straight to eternal damnation, because they only do lip service and swallow the world, the flesh, and the devil." For 15 wild minutes she talked, pouring out admonitions to flee the wrath to come, and her face flushed, her dead voice recaptured something of the shrill energy of the old Zilla. She wound up with a furious, "It's the blessing of God himself that Paul should be in prison now, and torn and humbled by punishment, so that he may yet save his soul, and so other wicked men, these horrible chasers of women in lust, may have an example." Babbitt had itched and twisted. As in church, he dared not move during the sermon, so now he felt he must seem attentive, though her screeching denunciations flew past him like carrion birds. He sought to be calm and brotherly. "Yes, I know, Zilla, but gosh, it certainly is the essence of religion to be charitable, isn't it? Let me tell you how I figure it. What we need in the world is liberalism. Liberally. If we're going to get anywhere. I've always believed in being broad-minded and liberal." "You? Liberal?" It was very much the old Zilla. "Why, George Babbitt, you're about as broad-minded and liberal as a razor blade."
"Oh, I am I? Well, just let me tell you, I'm as by golly liberal as you are religious. Anyway, you religious?"
"I am so. Our pastor says I sustain him in the faith."
"I'll bet you do, with Paul's money. But just to show you how liberal I am, I'm going to send a check for $10 to this Beecher Ingram, because a lot of fellows are saying the poor cuss preaches sedation and free love, and they're trying to run him out of town."
"And they're right. They ought to run him out of town. Why, he preaches, if you can call it preaching, in a theater, in the house of Satan. You don't know what it is to find God, to find peace, to behold the snares that the devil spreads out at our feet. Oh, I'm so glad to see the mysterious purposes of God in having Paul harm me and stop my wickedness. And Paul's getting his. Good and plenty for the cruel things he did to me. And I hope he dies in prison."
Babbitt was up, hat in hand, growling, "Well, if that's what you call being at peace, for heaven's sake, just warn me before you go to war, will you?"
3. Vast is the power of cities to reclaim the wanderer. More than mountains or the shore-devouring sea, a city retains its characters, imperturbable, cynical, holding behind apparent changes an essential purpose. Though Babbitt had deserted his family and dwelt with Joe Paradise in the wilderness, though he had become a liberal, though he had been quite sure, on the night before he reached Zenith, that neither he nor the city would be the same again, 10 days after his return, he could not believe that he had ever been away. Nor was it at all evident to his acquaintances that there was a new George F. Babbitt, save that he was more irritable under the incessant chaffing at the athletic club, and once, when Virgil Gunch observed that Seneca Doane ought to be hanged, Babbitt snorted, "Oh, rats, he's not so bad." At home he grunted, "Hey," across the newspaper to his commentatory wife, and was delighted by Tinka's new red tam-o'-shanter, and announced, "No class to that corrugated iron garage. Have to build me a nice frame one." Verona and Kenneth Escott appeared really to be engaged. In his newspaper, Escott had conducted a pure food crusade against commission houses. As a result, he had been given an excellent job in a commission house, and he was making a salary on which he could marry, and denouncing irresponsible reporters who wrote stories criticizing commission houses without knowing what they were talking about. This September, Ted had entered the State University as a freshman, in the College of Arts and Sciences. The university was at Mohalis, only 15 miles from Zenith, and Ted often came down for the weekend. Babbitt was worried. Ted was going in for everything but books. He had tried to make the football team as a light halfback. He was looking forward to the basketball season. He was on the committee for the freshman hop, and as a Zenithite, an aristocrat among yokels, he was being rushed by 2 fraternities. But of his studies Babbitt could learn nothing save a mumbled, "Oh, I think those Stimson teachers just give you a lot of junk about literature and economics." One weekend Ted proposed, "Say, Dad, why can't I transfer over from the College of the School of Engineers and take mechanical engineering? You always holler that I never study, but honest, I would study there."
"No, the engineering school hasn't got standing as the college has," fretted Babbitt.
I'd like to know how it hasn't. The engineers can play on any of the teams." There was much explanation of the dollars and cents values of being known as a college man when you go into the law, and truly oratorical account of the lawyer's life. Before he was through with it, Babbitt had Ted a United States Senator. Among the great lawyers he mentioned was Seneca Doane. "But gee whiz!" Ted marveled. "I thought you always said this Doane was a regular nut."
That's no way to speak of a great man. Doane's always been a good friend of mine. In fact, I helped him in college. I started him out, and you might say inspired him, just because he's sympathetic with the aims of labor. A lot of chumps that lack liberty and broad-mindedness think he's a crank. But let me tell you, there's mighty few of 'em that rake in the fees he does. And he's a friend of some of the strongest, most conservative men in the world, like Lord Wycombe, this big English nobleman that's so well known. And, which would you rather be, in with a lot of greasy mechanics and laboring men, or chum up to a real fellow like Lord Wycombe and get invited to his house for parties?"
"Well, gosh," sighed Ted. The next weekend he came joyously with, "Say, Dad, why couldn't I take mining engineering instead of the academic course? You talk about standing. Maybe there isn't much in mechanical engineering, but the miners, gee, they got 7 out of 11 of the new elections in New Tao 2." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 27. 1. The strike, which turned Zenith into 2 belligerent camps, white and red, began late in September with a walkout of telephone girls and linemen in protest against the reduction of wages. The newly formed Union of Dairy Product Workers went out, partially in sympathy and partially in demand for a 44-hour week. They were followed by the Truck Drivers' Union. Industry was tied up, and the whole city was nervous with talk of a trolley strike, a printer's strike, a general strike. Furious citizens, trying to get telephone calls through strike-breaking girls, danced helplessly. Every truck that made its way from the factories to the freight stations was guarded by a policeman trying to look stoical besides the scab driver. A line of 50 trucks from the Zenith Steel and Machinery Company was attacked by strikers rushing out from the sidewalk, pulling drivers from the seats, smashing carburetors and commutators, while telephone girls cheered from the walk and small boys heaved bricks. The National Guard was ordered out. Colonel Nixon, who in private life was Mr. Caleb Nixon, secretary of the Pullmore Tractor Company, put on a long khaki coat and stalked through crowds with a .44 automatic in his hand. Even Babbitt's friend Clarence Drum, the shoe merchant, a round and merry man who told stories at the athletic club and who strangely resembled a Victorian pug dog, was to be seen as a waddling but ferocious captain, with his belt tight about his comfortable little belly and his round little mouth petulant as he piped to chattering groups on corners, "Move on now. I can't have any of this loitering." Every newspaper in the city, save one, was against the strikers. When mobs raided the news-stands, at each was stationed a militiaman, a young, embarrassed citizen soldier with eyeglasses, bookkeeper or grocery clerk in private life, trying to look dangerous, while small boys yelped, "Get onto de tin soldier!" and striking truck drivers inquired tenderly, "Hey, Joe, when I was fighting in France, was you in camp in the States, or was you doing sweet exercises in the YMCA? Be careful that bayonet now, or you'll cut yourself." There was no one in Zenith who talked of anything but the strike, and no one who did not take sides. You were either a courageous friend of labor, or you were a fearless supporter of the rights of property, and in either case you were belligerent and ready to disown any friend who did not hate the enemy. A condensed milk plant was set afire. Each side charged the other, and the city was hysterical. And Babbitt chose this time to be publicly liberal. He belonged to the sound, sane, right-thinking wing, and at first he agreed that the crooked agitators ought to be shot. He was sorry when his friend Seneca Doane defended arrested strikers, and he thought of going to Doane and explaining about these agitators. But when he read a broadside alleging that even on their former wages the telephone girls had been hungry, he was troubled. "All lies and fake figures," he said, but in a doubtful croak. For the Sunday after, the Chatham Road Presbyterian Church announced a sermon by Dr. John Jennison Drew on how the Savior would end strikes. Babbitt had been negligent about church-going lately, but he went to the service, hopeful that Dr. Drew really did have the information as to what the divine powers thought about strikes. Beside Babbitt, in the large, curving, glossy, velvet-upholstered pew, was Chum Frink. Frink whispered, "Hope the doc gives the strikers hell. Ordinarily I don't believe in a preacher butting into political matters. Let him stick to straight religion and save souls, and not stir up a lot of discussion. But at a time like this, I do think he ought to stand up and bawl out those pug uglies in a fare you well." "Yeah, well," said Babbitt. The Reverend Dr. Drew, his rustic bang flopping with the intensity of his poetic and sociologicador, trumpeted, "During the untoward series of industrial dislocations which have let us be courageous and admit it boldly, throttled the business life of our fair city these past days, there has been a great deal of loose talk about scientific prevention of scientific. Now let me tell you that the most unscientific thing in the world is science. Take the attacks on the established fundamentals of the Christian creed, which were so popular with the scientists a generation ago. Oh, yes, they were mighty fellows, and great poobahs of criticism. They were going to destroy the church. They were going to prove the world was created and has been brought to its extraordinary level of morality and civilization by blind chance. Yet the church stands just as firmly today as ever, and the only answer a Christian pastor needs make to the long-haired opponents of his simple faith is just a pitying smile. And now these same scientists want to replace the natural condition of free competition by crazy systems which, no matter what high-sounding names they are called, are nothing but a despotic paternalism. Naturally, I'm not criticizing labor courts. Injunctions against men have proven to be striking unjustly, or those excellent unions in which the men and the boss get together. But I certainly am criticizing the system in which the free and fluid motivation of independent labor is to be replaced by crooked-up wage scales and minimum salaries, and government commissions and labor federations, and all that poppycock. What is not generally understood is that this whole industrial matter isn't a question of economics. It's essentially and only a matter of love, and of the practical application of the Christian religion. Imagine a factory, instead of committees of workmen alienating the boss. The boss goes among them smiling, and they smile back. The elder brother and the younger brothers. That's what they must be, loving brothers. And then strikes would be as inconceivable as hatred in the home. It was at this point that Babbitt muttered, "Oh, rot." "Huh?" said Chum Frink. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's just as clear as mud. Doesn't mean a darn thing." "Maybe, but—" Frink looked at him doubtfully. Through all the service kept glancing at him doubtfully, till Babbitt was nervous. 2. The strikers had announced a parade for Tuesday morning, but Colonel Nixon had forbidden it, the newspaper said. When Babbitt drove west from his office at 10 that morning, he saw a drove of shabby men heading towards the tangled, dirty district beyond Courthouse Square. He hated them, because they were poor, because they made him feel insecure. "Damn loafers. Wouldn't be common workmen if they had any pep," he complained. He wondered if there was going to be a riot. He drove toward the starting point of the parade, a tangle of limp and faded grass known as Moore Street Park, and halted his car. The park and streets were buzzing with strikers, young men in blue denim shirts, old men with caps. Through them, keeping them stirred like a boiling pot, moved the militiamen. Babbitt could hear the soldiers' monotonous orders. "Keep moving! Move on! Bo! Keep your feet warm!" Babbitt admired their stolid good temper. The crowd shouted, "Tin soldiers and dirty dogs, servants of the capitalist!" But the militiamen grinned and answered only, "Sure, that's right. Keep moving, Billy." Babbitt thrilled over the citizen soldiers, hated the scoundrels who were obstructing the pleasant ways of prosperity, admired Colonel Nixon's striding contempt for the crowd, and as Captain Clarence Drum, the rather puffing shoe dealer, came raging by, Babbitt respectfully clamored, "Great work, Captain. Don't let 'em march." He watched the strikers filing from the park. Many of them bore posters with, "They can't stop our peacefully walking." The militiamen tore away the posters, but the strikers fell in behind their leaders and straggled off, a thin, unimpressive trickle between steel glinting lines of soldiers. Babbitt saw with disappointment that there wasn't going to be any violence, nothing interesting at all. Then he gasped. Among the marchers, beside the bulky young workman, was Seneca Doane, smiling, content. In front of him was Professor Brockbank, head of the history department in the State University, an old man and white-bearded, known to come from a distinguished Massachusetts family. "My gosh," Babbitt marveled. "A swell like him in with the strikers, and good old Senny Doane. They're fools to get mixed up with this bunch. They're parlor socialists, but they have got nerve, and nothing in it for them, not a cent. And I don't know, it's all the strikers look as such tough nuts. Look just about like anybody else to me." The militiamen were turning the parade down a side street. "They got just as much right to march as anybody else. They own the street as much as Clarence Drum of the American Legion does," Babbitt grumbled. "'Course they're a bad element, but oh, rats." At the athletic club, Babbitt was silent during lunch, while the others fretted, "I don't know what the world's coming to," or solaced their spirits with kidding. Captain Clarence Drum came swinging by, splendid in khaki. "How's it going, Captain?" inquired Vergil Gunch. "Oh, we got 'em stopped. We worked 'em off on side streets and separated 'em, and they got discouraged and went home. Fine work. No violence." "Fine work, nothing," groaned Mr. Drum. "If I had my way, there'd be a whole lot of violence, and I'd start it, and then the whole thing would be over. I don't believe in standing back and wet-nursing these fellows and letting the disturbance drag on. I tell you, these strikers are nothing in God's world but a lot of bomb-throwing socialists and thugs, and the only way to handle 'em is with a club. That's what I'd do. Beat up the whole lot of 'em." Babbitt heard himself saying, "Oh, rats! Clarence, they look just about like you and me, and I certainly didn't notice any bombs." Drum complained, "Oh, you didn't, eh? Well, maybe you'd like to take charge of the strike. Just tell Colonel Nixon what innocents the strikers are. He'd be glad to hear about it." Drum strode on, while all the table stared at Babbitt. "What's the idea? Do you want us to give those hellhounds love and kisses, or what?" said Orville Jones. "Do you defend a lot of hoodlums that are trying to take the bread and butter away from our families?" raged Professor Pumphrey. Vergil Gunch intimidatingly said nothing. He put on sternness like a mask. His jaw was hard. His bristly short hair seemed cruel. His silence was a ferocious thunder. While the others assured Babbitt that they must have misunderstood him, Gunch looked as though he had understood only too well. Like a robed judge, he listened to Babbitt's stammering. "No, sure, of course they're a bunch of tough. But I just mean, strikes me as bad policy to talk about clubbing them. Cabe Nixon doesn't. He's got the fine Italian hand, and that's why he's colonel. Clarence Drum is jealous of him." "Well," said Professor Pumphrey, "you hurt Clarence's feelings, George. He's been out there all morning getting hot and dusty, and no wonder he wants to beat the tar out of those sons of guns." Gunch said nothing, and watched, and Babbitt knew that he was being watched. 3. As he was leaving the club, Babbitt heard Chum Frink protesting to Gunch, "Don't know what's got into him. Last Sunday Doc Drew preached a corking sermon about decency in business, and Babbitt kicked about that, too, near as I can figure out." Babbitt was vaguely frightened. 4. He saw a crowd listening to a man who was talking from the rostrum of a kitchen chair. Stopped his car. From newspaper pictures he knew that the speaker must be the notorious freelance preacher, Beecher Ingram, of whom Seneca Doane had spoken. Ingram was a gaunt man with flamboyant hair, weather-beaten cheeks, and worried eyes. He was pleading, "If those telephone girls can hold out, living on one meal a day, doing their own washing, starving and smiling, you big hulking men ought to be able—" Babbitt saw that from the sidewalk Vergil Gunch was watching him. In vague disquiet he started the car and mechanically drove on, while Gunch's hostile eyes seemed to follow him all the way.
5. "Heard a lot of these fellows," Babbitt was complaining to his wife, "that think if workmen go on strike they're a regular bunch of fiends. Now, of course, it's a fight between sound business and the destructive element, and we got to lick the rough stuffin's out of 'em when they challenge us, but doggone if I see why we can't fight like gentlemen and not go calling 'em dirty dogs and saying they ought to be shot down."
"Why, George," she said placidly, "I thought you always insisted that all strikers ought to be put in jail."
"Never did. Well, I mean, some of 'em, of course, they're responsible leaders, but I mean a fellow ought to be broad-minded and liberal about things like—"
"But, dearie, I thought you always said these so-called liberal people were the worst of—"
"Rats. Women never can understand the different definitions of a word. Depends on how you mean it. And it don't pay to be too cocksure about anything. Now these strikers, honest, they're not such bad people, just foolish. They don't understand the complications of merchandising and profit the way we business men do. But sometimes I think they're about like the rest of us, and no more hogs for wages than we are for profits."
"George, if people were to hear you talk like that— of course, I know you. I remember what a wild, crazy boy you were. I know you don't mean a word you say. But if people that don't understand you were to hear you talking like that, they'd think you were a regular socialist."
"What do I care what anybody thinks? And let me tell you right now, I want you to distinctly understand, I never was a wild, crazy kid. And when I say a thing, I mean it. I stand by it, and honest. Do you think people would think I was too liberal if I said the strikers were decent?"
"Of course they would. But don't worry, dear. I know you don't mean a word of it. Time to trot up to bed now. Have you enough covers for tonight?"
On the sleeping porch he puzzled. She doesn't understand me. Hardly understands myself. Why can't I take things easy the way I used to? Wish I could go out to Sandy Dunn's house and talk things over with him. No, suppose Verg Gunch saw me going in there. Wish I knew some really smart woman and nice that would see what I'm trying to get at. Let me talk to her, and wonder if Myra's right. Could the fellows think I've gone nutty just because I'm broad-minded and liberal? Way Verg looked at me.
End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 28. 1. Miss McGowan came into his private office at 3 in the afternoon with, "Listen, Mr. Babbitt, there's a Mrs. Judique on the phone. Wants to see about some repairs, and the salesmen are all out. Want to talk to her?"
All right.
The voice of Tanis Judique was clear and pleasant. The black cylinder of the telephone receiver seemed to hold a tiny animated image of her, lustrous eyes, delicate nose, gentle chin. This is Mrs. Judique. Do you remember me? You drove me up here to the Cavendish Apartments and helped me find such a nice flat."
"Sure, bet I remember. What can I do for you?"
"Why, it's just a little. I don't know that I ought to bother you, but the janitor doesn't seem to be able to fix it. You know my flat is on the top floor. With these autumn rains, the roof is beginning to leak, and I'd be awfully glad if—"
"Sure, I'll come up and take a look at it," nervously. "When do you expect to be in?"
"Why, I'm in every morning."
"Be in this afternoon, in an hour or so?"
"Yes. Perhaps I could give you a cup of tea. I think I ought to, after all your trouble."
"Fine. I'll run up there as soon as I can get away." He meditated. "Now there's a woman that's got refinement, savvy, class. After all your trouble, give you a cup of tea. She'd appreciate a fellow. I'm a fool, but I'm not such a bad cuss. Get to know me, and not so much a fool as they think." The great strike was over. The strikers beaten, except that Vergil Gunch seemed less cordial. There were no visible effects of Babbitt's treachery to the clan. The oppressive fear of criticism was gone, but a different loneliness remained. Now he was so exhilarated that, to prove he wasn't, he droned about the office for 15 minutes, looking at blueprints, explaining to Miss McGowan that this Mrs. Scott wanted more money for her house, had raised the asking price, raised it from $7,000 to $8,500. Would Miss McGowan be sure to put it down on the card? Mrs. Scott's house, raise. When he had thus established himself as a person unemotional and interested only in business, he sauntered out. He took a particularly long time to start his car. He kicked the tires, dusted the glass of the speedometer, and tightened the screws holding the windshield spotlight. He drove happily off towards the Bellevue district, conscious of the presence of Mrs. Judique as a brilliant light on the horizon. The maple leaves had fallen, and they lined the gutters of the asphalted streets. It was a day of pale gold and faded green, tranquil and lingering. Babbitt was aware of the meditative day, and of the barrenness of Bellevue. Blocks of wooden houses, garages, little shops, weedy lots. "Needs pepping up, needs the touch that people like Mrs. Judique could give a place," he ruminated as he rattled through the long, crude, airy streets. The wind rose, enlivening, keen, and in a blaze of well-being he came to the flat of Tanis Judique. She was wearing, when she flatteringly admitted him, a frock of black chiffon cut modestly round at the base of her pretty throat. She seemed to him very sophisticated. He glanced at the cretonnes and colored prints in her living room and gurgled, "Gosh, you've fixed the place up nice. Takes a clever woman to know how to make a home all right." "You really like it. I'm so glad. But you've neglected me scandalously. You promised to come up sometime and learn to dance." Rather unsteadily, "Oh, but you didn't mean it seriously." "Perhaps not, but you might have tried." "Well, here I've come for my lesson, and you might just as well prepare to have me stay for supper."
They both laughed in a manner which indicated that of course he didn't mean it.
"But first I guess I better look at the leak."
She climbed with him to the flat roof of the apartment house, a detached world of slatted wooden walks, clothesline, water tank, and a penthouse. He poked at things with his toe and sought to impress her by being learned about copper gutters, the desirability of passing plumbing pipes through a lead collar and sleeve and flashing them with copper, and the advantages of cedar over boiler iron for roof tanks. "You have to know so much in real estate," she admired.
He promised that the roof should be repaired within 2 days. Do you mind my phoning from your apartment?" he asked.
"Heavens, no."
He stood for a moment at the coping, looking over land of hard little bungalows with abnormally large porches in new apartment houses, small but brave, with variegated brick walls and terracotta trimmings. Beyond them was a hill with a gouge of yellow clay like a vast wound. Behind every apartment house, beside each dwelling, were small garages. It was a world of good little people, comfortable, industrious, credulous.
In the autumnal light the flat newness was mellowed, and the air was a sun-tinted pool.
"Golly, it's one fine afternoon. You get a great view here, right up Tanner's Hill," said Babbitt.
"Yes, it's nice and open."
"So darn few people appreciate a view."
"Don't you go raising my rent on that account." "Oh, that was naughty of me. I was just teasing. Seriously, though, there are so few people who respond, who react to views, I mean. They haven't any feeling of poetry and beauty."
"That's a fact. They haven't," he breathed, admiring her slenderness and the absorbed, airy way in which she looked toward the hill, chin lifted, lips smiling. "Well, guess I'd better telephone the plumbers so they'll get on the job first thing in the morning."
When he had telephoned, making it conspicuously authoritative and gruff and masculine, he looked doubtful and sighed,
"Suppose I better be—"
"Oh, you must have a cup of tea first."
"Well, it would go pretty good at that."
It was luxurious to loll in a deep green rep chair, his legs thrust out before him, to glance at the black Chinese telephone stand and the colored photograph of Mount Vernon, which he had always liked so much, while in the tiny kitchen so near, Mrs. Judique sang "My Creole Queen" in an intolerable sweetness, a contentment so deep that he was wistfully discontented. He saw magnolias by moonlight and heard plantation darkies crooning to the banjo. He wanted to be near her on pretense of helping her, yet he wanted to remain in his still ecstasy. Languidly he remained. When she bustled in with tea, he smiled up at her.
"This is awfully nice."
For the first time he was not fencing. He was quietly and securely friendly, and friendly and quiet was her answer. "It's nice to have you here. You were so kind, helping me to find this little home." They agreed that the weather would soon turn cold. They agreed that prohibition was prohibitive. They agreed that art in the home was cultural. They agreed about everything. They even became bold. They hinted that these modern young girls, well, honestly, their short skirts were short. They were proud to find that they were not shocked by such frank speaking. Tanis ventured, "I know you'll understand. I mean, I don't quite know how to say it, but I do think that girls who pretend they're bad by the way they dress really never go any further. They give away the fact that they haven't the instincts of a womanly woman." Remembering Ida Pudink, the manicure girl, and how ill she had used him, Babbitt agreed with enthusiasm. Remembering how ill all the world had used him, he told of Paul Riesling, of Zilla, of Seneca Doane, of the strike.
"See how it was? Course I was as anxious to have these beggars licked to a standstill as anybody else, but gosh, no reason for not seeing their side. For a fellow of his own sake, he's got to be broad-minded and liberal. Don't you think so?"
"Oh, I do." Sitting on the hard little couch, she clasped her hands beside her, leaned toward him, absorbed him, and in a glorious state of being appreciated, he proclaimed,
"So I up and said to the fellows at the club, 'Look here,
Do you belong to the Union Club? I think it's—"
"No, the Athletic. Tell you, course they're always asking me to join the Union, but I always say no. No, sir. Nothing doing. I don't mind the expense, but I can't stand all the old fogies."
"Oh, yes, that's all. But tell me, what did you say to them?"
"Oh, you don't want to hear it. I'm probably boring you to death with my troubles. You wouldn't hardly think I was an old duffer. I sound like a kid."
"Oh, you're a boy yet. I mean, you can't be a day over 45.
"Well, I'm not much, but by golly, I begin to feel middle-aged sometimes. All these responsibilities and all."
"Oh, I know." Her voice caressed him. It cloaked him like warm silk. "And I feel lonely, so lonely some days, Mr. Babbitt."
"We're a sad pair of birds, but I think we're pretty darn nice."
"Yes, I think we're a lot nicer than most people I know." They smiled. "But please, tell me what you said at the club."
"Well, it was like this. Course Seneca Doane is a friend of mine. They can say what they want to. They can call him anything they please. But
What most folks here don't know is that Senny is the bosom pal of some of the biggest statesmen in the world. Lord Wycombe, for instance. You know, this big British nobleman. My friend Sir Gerald Doak told me that Lord Wycombe is one of the biggest guns in England. Well, Doak or somebody told me." "Oh, do you know Sir Gerald? The one that was here at McKelvey's?"
"Know him? Well, say, I know him just well enough so we call each other George and Jerry, and we got so pickled in Chicago."
"That must have been fun, but—" She shook a finger at him. "I can't have you getting pickled. I'll have to take you in hand."
"Wish you would. Well, as I was saying, you see, I happen to know what a big noise Sonny Doane is outside of Zenith. But of course the prophet hasn't got any honor in his own country, and Senny, darn his old hide, he's so blame modest that he never lets folks know the kind of an outfit he travels with when he goes abroad. Well, during the strike, Clarence Drum comes parading up to our table, all dolled up fit to kill in his nice little captain's uniform, and somebody says to him, 'Bustin' the strike, Clarence?' Well, he swells up like a pouter pigeon, and he hollers, so's you could hear him, away up in the reading room, 'Yes, sure, I told the strike leaders where they got off, and so they went home.' Well, I says to him, glad there wasn't any violence. 'Yes,' he says, 'but if I hadn't 'a' kept my skin, there would have been. All those fellows had bombs in their pockets. They're regular anarchists.' 'Oh, rats, Clarence,' I says. 'I looked 'em all over carefully, and they didn't have any more bombs than a rabbit,' I says. 'Course,' I says, 'they're foolish, but they're a good deal like you and me, after all.' And then Virgil Gunch or somebody, no, it was Chum Frink, you know, the famous poet, great pal of mine, he says to me, 'Look here,' he says, 'do you mean to say you advocate these strikes?' Well, I was so disgusted with a fellow whose mind worked that way that I swear I had a good mind to not explain it all, just ignore him."
"Oh, that's so wise," said Mrs. Judique.
But finally I explains to him, if you'd done as much as I have on Chamber of Commerce committees and all, I says, then you'd have the right to talk. But same time, I says, I believe in treating your opponent like a gentleman. Well, sir, that held him. Frank, Chum, I always call him. He didn't have another word to say, but at that, I guess some of 'em kind of thought I was too liberal. What do you think?"
"Oh, you were so wise and courageous. I love a man to have the courage of his convictions."
"But do you think it was a good stunt? After all, some of these fellows are so darn cautious and narrow-minded that they're prejudiced against the fellow that talks right out of a meeting."
"What do you care? In the long run, they're bound to respect a man who makes them think. And with your reputation for oratory, you—"
"What do you know about my reputation for oratory?"
"Oh, I'm not going to tell you everything I know, but seriously, you don't realize what a famous man you are."
"Well, though I haven't done much orating this fall. Too kind of bothered by this Paul Riesling business, I guess. But do you know, you're the first person that's really understood what I was getting at. Tanis, listen to me, will you? Fat nerve I've got calling you Tanis." "Oh, do, and shall I call you George? Don't you think it's awfully nice when two people have so much shall I call it, so much analysis that they can discard all the stupid conventions and understand each other and become acquainted right away, like ships that pass in the night?" "I certainly do. I certainly do."
He was no longer quiescent in his chair. He wandered about the room. He dropped on the couch beside her. But as he awkwardly stretched his hands toward her fragile, immaculate fingers, she said brightly, "Do give me a cigarette. Would you think poor Tanis was dreadfully naughty if she smoked?"
"Lord, no, I like it."
He had often and weightily pondered flappers smoking in Zenith restaurants, but he knew only one woman who smoked, Mrs. Sam Doppelbrau, this flighty neighbor. He ceremoniously lighted Tanis's cigarette, looked for a place to deposit the burnt match, and dropped it into his pocket. "I'm sure you want a cigar, you poor man," she crooned.
Do you mind one?"
"Oh, no. I love the smell of a good cigar. So nice and like a man. You'll find an ashtray in my bedroom, on the table beside the bed, if you don't mind getting it." He was embarrassed by her bedroom, the broad couch with a cover of violet silk, mauve curtains striped with gold, Chinese Chippendale bureau, and an amazing row of slippers with ribbon-wound shoe trees, and primrose stockings lying across them. His manner of bringing the ashtray had just the right note of easy friendliness, he felt.
A boob like Virgil Gunch would try to get funny about seeing her bedroom, but I take it casually.
He was not casual afterward. The contentment of companionship was gone, and he was restless with desire to touch her hand. But whenever he turned toward her, the cigarette was in his way. It was a shield between them. He waited till she should have finished, but as he rejoiced at the quick crushing of its light on the ashtray, she said, "Don't you want to give me another cigarette?" And hopelessly he saw the screen of pale smoke and her graceful, tilted hand again between them. He was not merely curious now to find out whether she would let him hold her hand, all in the purest friendship, naturally, but agonized with need of it. On the surface appeared none of all this fretful drama. They were talking cheerfully of motors, of trips to California, of Chum Frink. Once he said delicately,
"I do hate these guys. I hate these people that invite themselves to meals, but I seem to have a feeling I'm going to have supper with the lovely Mrs. Tanis Judique tonight. But I suppose you probably already have 7 dates already."
"Well, I was thinking of going to the movies. Yes, I really think I ought to get out and get some fresh air." She did not encourage him to stay, but never did she discourage him. He considered,
"I better take a sneak. She will let me stay. There is something doing, and I mustn't get mixed up with. I mustn't. I've got to beat it. Then no, it's too late now."
Suddenly, at 7, brushing her cigarette away, briskly taking her hand,
"Tanis, stop teasing me. You know here we are, a couple of lonely birds, and we're awfully happy together. Anyway, I am. Never been so happy. Do let me stay. I'll gallop down to the delicatessen and buy some stuff, cold chicken maybe, or cold turkey, and we can have a nice little supper, and afterwards, if you want to chase me out, I'll be good and go like a lamb."
"Well, yes, it would be nice," she said. Nor did she withdraw her hand. He squeezed it, trembling, and blundered toward his coat. At the delicatessen he bought preposterous stores of food, chosen on the principle of expensiveness. From the drugstore across the street he telephoned to his wife.
Got to get a fellow to sign a lease before he leaves town on the midnight. Won't be home till late. Don't wait up for me. Kiss Tinka good night."
He expectantly lumbered back to the flat. "Oh, you bad thing, you buy so much food," was her greeting, and her voice was gay, her smile acceptant. He helped her in the tiny white kitchen. He washed the lettuce, he opened the olive bottle. She ordered him to set the table, and as he trotted into the living room, as he hunted through the buffet for knives and forks, he felt utterly at home. "Now the only other thing," he announced, "is what you're going to wear. I can't decide whether you're to put on your swellest evening gown, or let your hair down and put on short skirts and make believe you're a little girl." "I'm going to dine just as I am in this old chiffon rag, and if you can't stand poor Tanis that way, you can go to the club for dinner."
"Stand you?" He patted her shoulder. "Child, you're the brainiest and the loveliest and finest woman I've ever met. Come now, Lady Wycombe, if you'll take the Duke of Zenith's arm, we will perambulate to the Magnolia's feed."
"Oh, you do say the funniest and nicest things." When they had finished the picnic supper, he thrust his head out of the window and reported,
"It's turned awful chilly, and I think it's going to rain. You don't want to go to the movies."
"Well,
I wish we had a fireplace, and I wish it was raining like all get out tonight. And I wish we were in a funny little old-fashioned cottage, and the trees thrashing like everything outside, and a great big log fire." And I'll tell you, let's draw this couch up to the radiator and stretch our feet out and pretend it's a wood fire."
"Oh, I think that's pathetic, you big child."
But they did draw up to the radiator and prop their feet against it, his clumsy black shoes, her patent leather slippers. In the dimness they talked of themselves, of how lonely she was, how bewildered he, and how wonderful that they had found each other. As they fell silent, the room was stiller than a country lane. There was no sound from the street save the whir of motor tires, the rumble of a distant freight train. Self-contained was the room, warm, secure, insulated from the harassing world. He was absorbed by a rapture in which all fear and doubting were smothered away, and when he reached home at dawn the rapture had mellowed to contentment, serene and full of memories. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti. MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 29. 1. The assurance of Tanis Judique's friendship fortified Babbitt's self-approval. At the athletic club he became experimental. Though Vergil Gunch was silent, the others at the Roughnecks table came to accept Babbitt as having, for no visible reason, turned crank. They argued windily with him, and he was cocky and enjoyed the spectacle of his interesting martyrdom. He even praised Seneca Doane. Professor Pumphrey said that was carrying a joke too far, but Babbitt argued, "No, fact, I tell you he's got one of the keenest intellects in the country. Why, Lord Wycombe said that—" "Oh, who the hell is Lord Wycombe? What you always lugging him in for? You've been touting him for the last 6 weeks," protested Orville Jones. "George ordered him from Sears Roebuck. You can get those English high muckamucks by mail for $2 apiece," suggested Sidney Finkelstein. "That's all right now. Lord Wycombe, he's one of the biggest intellects in English political life. As I was saying, of course I'm conservative myself, but I appreciate a guy like Senny Doane because—" Vergil Gunch interrupted harshly. "I wonder if you are so conservative. I find I can manage to run my own business without any skunks and reds like Doane in it." The grimness of Gunch's voice, the hardness of his jaw, disconcerted Babbitt, but he recovered and went on till they looked bored, then irritated, then as doubtful as Gunch. 2. He thought of Tanis always. With a stir he remembered her every aspect. His arms yearned for her. "I've found her. I've dreamed of her all these years, and now I've found her," he exulted. He met her at the movies in the morning. He drove out to her flat in the late afternoon, or on evenings when he was believed to be at the Elks. He knew her financial affairs and advised her about them. When she lamented her feminine ignorance and praised his masterfulness, and proved to know much more about bonds than he did, they had remembrances and laughter over old times. Once they quarreled, and he raged that she was as bossy as his wife, and far more whining when he was inattentive, but that passed safely. Their high hour was a tramp on a ringing December afternoon, through snow-drifted meadows down to the icy Chaloosa's River. She was exotic in an astrakhan cap and a short beaver coat. She slid on the ice and shouted, and he panted after her, rotund with laughter. Myra Babbitt never slid on the ice. He was afraid that they would be seen together. In Zenith it is impossible to lunch with a neighbor's wife without the fact being known before nightfall in every house in your circle. But Tanis was beautifully discreet. However appealingly she might turn to him when they were alone, she was gravely detached when they were abroad, and he hoped that she would be taken for a client. Orville Jones once saw them emerging from a movie theater, and Babbitt bumbled, "Let me make you acquainted with Mrs. Judique. Now here's a lady who knows the right broker to come to, Orvie." Mr. Jones, though he was a man censorious of morals and of laundry machinery, seemed satisfied.
His predominant fear, not from any especial fondness for her, but from the habit of propriety, was that his wife would learn of the affair. He was certain that she knew nothing specific about Tanis, but he was also certain that she suspected something indefinite. For years she had been bored by anything more affectionate than a farewell kiss, yet she was hurt by any slacking in his irritable periodic interest, and now he had no interest, rather a revulsion. He was completely faithful to Tanis. He was distressed by the sight of his wife's slack plumpness, by her puffs and billows of flesh, by the tattered petticoat which she was always meaning and always forgetting to throw away. But he was aware that she, so long attuned to him, caught all his repulsions. He elaborately, heavily, jocularly tried to check them. He couldn't. They had a tolerable Christmas. Kenneth Escott was there, admittedly engaged to Verona. Mrs. Babbitt was cheerful and called Kenneth her new son. Babbitt was worried about Ted, because he had ceased complaining of the State University and become suspiciously acquiescent. He wondered what the boy was planning, and was too shy to ask. Himself, Babbitt slipped away on Christmas afternoon to take his present, a silver cigarette box, to Tanis. When he returned, Mrs. Babbitt asked, much too innocently, "Did you go out for a little fresh air?" "Yes, just a little drive," he mumbled. After New Year's his wife proposed, "I heard from my sister today, George. She isn't well. I think perhaps I ought to stay with her for a few weeks." Now Mrs. Babbitt was not accustomed to leave home during the winter except on violently demanding occasions, and only the summer before she had been gone for weeks. Nor was Babbitt one of the detachable husbands who take separations casually. He liked to have her there. She looked after his clothes, she knew how his steak ought to be cooked, and her clucking made him feel secure. But he could not drum up even a dutiful, "Oh, she doesn't really need you, does she?" when he tried to look regretful. While he felt that his wife was watching him, he was filled with exultant visions of Tanis. "Do you think I better go?" she said sharply. "You got to decide, honey. I can't." She turned away, sighing, and his forehead was damp. Till she went 4 days later, she was curiously still, he cumbrously affectionate. Her train left at noon. As he saw it grow small beyond the train shed, he longed to hurry to Tanis. "No, by God, I won't do that," he vowed. "I won't go near her for a week." But he was at her flat at 4. 3. He, who had once controlled, or seemed to control, his life in a progress unimpassioned but diligent and sane, was for that fortnight borne on a current of desire and very bad whiskey, and all the complications of new acquaintances, those furious new intimates who demanded so much more attention than old friends. Each morning he gloomily recognized his idiocies of the evening before. With his head throbbing, his tongue and lips stinging from cigarettes, he incredulously counted the number of drinks he had taken, and groaned, "I gotta quit." He had ceased saying, "I will quit." For however resolute he might be at dawn, he could not for a single evening check his drift. He had met Tanis's friends. He had, with the ardent haste of the midnight people who drink and dance and rattle and are ever afraid to be silent, been adopted as a member of her group, which they called the Bunch. He first met them after a day when he had worked particularly hard, and when he hoped to be quiet with Tanis and slowly sip her admiration. From down the hall he could hear shrieks and the grind of a phonograph. As Tanis opened the door, he saw fantastic figures dancing in a haze of cigarette smoke. The tables and chairs were against the wall. "Oh, isn't this dandy!" She grabbed at him. "Carrie Nork had the loveliest idea. She decided it was time for a party, and she's phoned the Bunch and told 'em to gather round. George, this is Carrie." Carrie was, in the less desirable aspects of both, at once matronly and spinsterish. She was perhaps 40. Her hair was an unconvincing ash blonde, and if her chest was flat her hips were ponderous. She greeted Babbitt with a giggling, "Welcome to our little midst."
Tanis says you're a great sport." He was apparently expected to dance, to be boyish and gay with Carrie, and he did his unforgiving best. He told her about the room, bumping into other couples, into the radiator, into chair legs cunningly ambushed. As he danced, he surveyed the rest of the bunch. A thin young woman who looked capable, conceited, and sarcastic. Another woman who he could never quite remember. 3 overdressed and slightly effeminate young men, soda fountain clerks, or at least born for that profession. A man of his own age, immovable, self-satisfied, resentful of Babbitt's presence. When he had finished his dutiful dance, Tanis took him aside and begged, "Dear, wouldn't you like to do something for me? I'm all out of booze, and the bunch wants to celebrate. Couldn't you just skip down to Healey Hanson's and get some?"
"Sure," he said, trying not to sound sullen.
"I'll tell you, I'll get Minnie Sonntag to drive down with you." Tanis was pointing to the thin, sarcastic young woman. Miss Sonntag greeted him with a astringent, "How do you do, Mr. Babbitt? Tanis tells me you're a very prominent man. I'm honored to be allowed to drive with you. Of course, I'm not accustomed to associating with society people like you, so I don't know how to act in such exalted circles." Thus Miss Sonntag talked all the way down to Healey Hanson's. To her jibes he wanted to reply, "Oh, go to the devil," but he never quite nerved himself to do that. Reasonable comment. He was resenting the existence of the whole bunch. He had heard Tanis speak of darling Carrie and Min Sonntag. "She's so clever you'll adore her." But they had never been real to him. He had pictured Tanis as living in a rose-tinted vacuum, waiting for him, free of all the complications of a Floral Heights. When they returned, he had to endure the patronage of the young soda clerks. They were as damply friendly as Miss Sonntag was dryly hostile. They called him Old Georgie and shouted, "Come on now, sport, shake a leg." Boys in belted coats, pimply boys as young as Ted and as flabby as chorus-men, but powerful to dance and to mind the phonograph and smoke cigarettes and patronize Tanis. He tried to be one of them. He cried, "Good work, Pete," but his voice creaked. Tanis apparently enjoyed the companionship of the dancing darlings. She bridled to their bland flirtation and casually kissed them at the end of each dance. Babbitt hated her for the moment. He saw her as middle-aged. He studied the wrinkles in the softness of her throat, the slack flesh beneath her chin. The taut muscles of her youth were loose and drooping. Between dances she sat in the largest chair, waving her cigarette, summoning her callow admirers to come and talk to her. "She thinks she's a bloomin' queen," growled Babbitt. She chanted to Miss Sonntag, "Isn't my little studio sweet?" "Studio rats! It's a plain old maid and chow dog flat. Oh, God, I wish I was home. I wonder if I can't make a getaway now." His vision grew blurred, however, as he plied himself to Healey Hanson's raw but vigorous whiskey. He blended with the bunch. He began to rejoice that Carrie Nork and Pete, the most nearly intelligent of the nimble youth, seemed to like him, and it was enormously important to win over the surly older man, who proved to be a railway clerk named Fulton Bemis. The conversation of the bunch was exclamatory, high-colored, full of references to people whom Babbitt did not know. Apparently they thought very comfortably of themselves. They were the bunch, wise and beautiful and amusing. They were bohemians and urbanites, accustomed to all the luxuries of Zenith, dance halls, movie theaters, and roadhouses, and in a cynical superiority to people who were slow or tightwad. They cackled. "Oh, Pete, did I tell you what that dub of a cashier said when I came in late yesterday? Oh, it was perfectly priceless." "Oh, but wasn't T.D. stewed? Say, he was simply ossified. What did Gladys say to him? Think of the nerve of Bob Bixford trying to get us to come to his house. Say, the nerve of him. Can you beat it for nerve? Some nerve, I call it. Did you notice how Dottie was dancing? Gee, wasn't she the limit?" Babbitt was to be heard sonorously agreeing with the once-hated Miss Mimi Sonntag that persons who let a night go by without dancing to jazz music were crabs, pikers, and poor fish, and he roared, "You bet!" when Mrs. Carrie Nork gurgled, Don't you love to sit on the floor? It's so bohemian." He began to think extremely well of the Bunch. When he mentioned his friends Sir Gerald Dork, Lord Whitcomb, William Washington Earthorne, and Chum Frink, he was proud of their condescending interest. He got so thoroughly in the jocund spirit that he didn't much mind seeing Tanis drooping against the shoulder of the youngest and milkiest of the young men, and he himself desired to hold Carrie Nork's pulpy hand, and dropped it only because Tanis looked angry. When he went home at 2, he was fully a member of the Bunch, and all the week thereafter he was bound by the exceedingly strained conventions, the exceedingly wearing demands of their life of pleasure and freedom. He had to go to their parties. He was involved in the agitation when everybody telephoned to everybody else that she hadn't meant what she'd said when she'd said that. And anyway, why was Pete going around saying she'd said it? Never was a family more insistent on learning one another's movements than were the Bunch. All of them volubly knew, or indignantly desired to know, where all the others had been every minute of the week. Babbitt found himself explaining to Carrie or Fulton Bemis just what he had been doing, that he should not have joined them till 10 o'clock, and apologizing for having gone to dinner with a business acquaintance. Every member of the Bunch was expected to telephone to every other member at least once a week. "Why haven't you called me up?" Babbitt was asked accusingly, not only by Tanis and Carrie, but presently by new ancient friends, Jenny and Captoni and Toots. If for a moment he had seen Tanis as withering and sentimental, he lost that impression at Carrie Nork's dance. Mrs. Nork had a huge house and a small husband. To her party came all of the Bunch, perhaps 35 of them. When they were completely mobilized, Babbitt, under the name of Old Georgie, was now a pioneer of the Bunch, since each month it changed half its membership, and he who could recall the prehistoric days of a fortnight ago, before Mrs. Absalom, the food demonstrator, had gone to Indianapolis and Mac had got sore at Minnie, was a veritable leader and able to condescend to new Petes and Minnies and Gladyses. At Carrie's, Tanis did not have to work at being hostess. She was dignified and sure, a clear, fine figure in the black chiffon frock he had always loved, and in the wider spaces of the ugly house Babbitt was able to sit quietly with her. He repented of his first revulsion, mooned at her feet, and happily drove her home. Next day he bought a violent yellow tie to make himself young for her. He knew a little sadly that he could not make himself beautiful. He beheld himself as heavy, hinting of fatness. But he danced, he dressed, he chatted, to be as young as she was, as young as she seemed to be. 4. As all converts, whether to a religion, love, or gardening, find as by magic that though hitherto these hobbies have not seemed to exist, now the whole world is filled with their fury. So, once he was converted to dissipation, Babbitt discovered agreeable opportunities for it everywhere. He had a new view of his sporting neighbor, Sam Doppelbrau. The Doppelbraus were respectable people, industrious people, prosperous people, whose ideal of happiness was an eternal cabaret. Their life was dominated by suburban bacchanalia of alcohol, nicotine, gasoline, and kisses. They and their set worked capably all the week, and all week looked forward to Saturday night, when they would, as he expressed it, throw a party. And the thrown party grew noisier and noisier up to Sunday dawn, and usually included an extremely rapid motor expedition to nowhere in particular. One evening when Tanis was at the theater, Babbitt found himself being lively with the Doppelbraus, pledging friendship with men whom he had for years privately denounced to Mrs. Babbitt as a rotten bunch of tin horns that I wouldn't go out with, rot if they were the last people on the earth. That evening he had sulkily come home and poked about the front of the house, chipping off the walk the ice clots, like fossil footprints, made by the steps of passers-by during the recent snow. Howard Littlefield came up snuffling. "So winter war, George?" "Yep. Cold again tonight." "What do you hear from the wife?" She's feeling fine, but her sister's still pretty sick. Hey, better come in and have dinner with us tonight, George." "Oh, thanks. Have to go out." Suddenly he could not endure Littlefield's recitals of the more interesting statistics about totally uninteresting problems. He scraped at the walk and grunted. Sam Doppelbrau appeared. "Evening, Babbitt. Working hard?" "Yep. Little exercise." "Cold enough for you tonight?" "Well, just about." "Still a widower?" "Uh-huh." "Say, Babbitt, while she's away, I know you don't care much for booze fights, but the missus and I'd be awfully glad if you would come in some night. Think you could stand a good cocktail for once?" "Stand it, young fella? I bet old Uncle George can mix the best cocktail in these United States." "Hooray, that's the way to talk. Look here, there's some folks coming to the house tonight, Louetta Swanson and some other live ones, and I'm going to open up a bottle of pre-war gin, and maybe we'll dance a while. Why don't you drop in, jazz it up a little, just for a change?" "Well, what time they coming?" He was at the Sam Doppelbrau's at 9. It was the third time he had entered the house. By 10 he was calling Mr. Doppelbrau "Sam, old hoss." At 11 they all drove out to the Old Farm Inn. Babbitt sat in the back of Doppelbrau's car with Louetta Swanson. Once he had timorously tried to make love to her. Now he did not try, he merely made love, and Louetta dropped her head on his shoulder, told him what a nagger Eddie was, and accepted Babbitt as a decent and well-trained libertine. With the assistance of Tanis's bunch, the Doppelbraus and other companions in forgetfulness, there was not an evening for 2 weeks when he did not return home late and shaky. With his other faculties blurred, he yet had the motorist's gift of being able to drive when he could scarce walk, of slowing down at corners and allowing for approaching cars. He came wobbling into the house. If Verona and Kenneth Escott were about, he got past them with a hasty greeting, horribly aware of their level young glances, and hid himself upstairs. He found when he came into the warm house that he was hazier than he had believed. His head whirled. He dared not lie down. He tried to soak out the alcohol in the hot bath. For the moment his head was clearer, but when he moved about the bathroom his calculations of distance were wrong, so that he dragged down the towels and knocked over the soap dish with a clatter which he feared would betray him to the children. Chilly in his dressing gown, he tried to read the evening paper. He could follow every word. He seemed to take in the sense of things, but a minute afterward he could not have told what he had been reading. When he went to bed his brain flew in circles, and he hastily sat up, struggling for self-control. At last he was able to lie still, feeling only a little sick and dizzy, and enormously ashamed. To hide his condition from his own children, to have danced and shouted with people whom he despised, to have said foolish things, sung idiotic songs, tried to kiss silly girls. Incredulously he remembered that he had, by his roaring familiarity with them, laid himself open to the patronizing of youth whom he would have kicked out of his office, that by dancing too ardently he had exposed himself to rebukes from the rattiest of withering women. As it came relentlessly back to him, he snarled, "I hate myself. God, how I hate myself." But he raged, "I'm through. No more. Had enough. Plenty." He was even surer about it the morning after, when he was trying to be grave and paternal with his daughters at breakfast. At noontime he was less sure. He did not deny that he had been a fool. He saw it almost as clearly as at midnight, but anything he struggled was better than going back to a life of barren heartiness. At 4 he wanted to drink. He kept a whiskey flask in his desk now, and after 2 minutes of battle he had his drink. 3 drinks later he began to see the bunch as tender and amusing friends, and by 6 he was with them, and the tale was to be told all over. Each morning his head ached a little less. A bad head of her drinks had been his safeguard, but the safeguard was crumbling. Presently he could be drunk at dawn, yet not feel particularly wretched in his conscience or in his stomach when he awoke at 8. No regret, no desire to escape the toil of keeping up with the arduous merriment of the bunch, was so great as his feeling of social inferiority,
when he failed to keep up. To be the liveliest of them was as much his ambition now as it had been to excel at making money, at playing golf, at motor driving, at oratory, at climbing to the McKelvey set. But occasionally he failed. He found that Pete and the other young men considered the Bunch too austerely polite, and the Carrie who merely kissed behind doors too embarrassingly monogamic. As Babbitt sneaked from the Floral Heights down to the Bunch, so the young gallants snaked from the properties of the Bunch off to times with bouncing young women whom they picked up in department stores and at hotel coat-rooms. Once Babbitt tried to accompany them. There was a motor car, a bottle of whiskey, and for him a grubby, shrieking cash girl from Parcher and Stein's. He sat beside her and worried. He was apparently expected to jolly her along, but when she sang out, "Hey, Lingo, quit crushing me, cootie garage," he did not quite know how to go on. They sat in the back room of a saloon, and Babbitt had a headache. He was confused by their new slang, looked at them benevolently, wanted to go home, and had a drink. A good many drinks. 2 evenings after, Fulton Bemis, the surly older man of the Bunch, took Babbitt aside and grunted, "Look here, it's none of my business, and God knows I always lap up my share of the hooch, but don't you think you better watch yourself? You're one of the enthusiastic chumps that always overdo things. Do you realize you're throwing in the booze as fast as you can, and you eat one cigarette right after the other? Better cut it out for a while." Babbitt tearfully said that good old Fult was a prince, and yes, he certainly would cut it out, and thereafter he lighted a cigarette and took a drink, and had a horrific quarrel with Tanis when she caught him being affectionate with Carrie Nork. Next morning he hated himself that he should have sunk into a position where a 15th-rater like Fulton Bemis could rebuke him. He perceived that since he was making love to every woman possible, Tanis was no longer his one pure star, and he wondered whether she had ever been anything more to him than a woman. And if Bemis had spoken to him, were other people talking about him? He suspiciously watched the men at the athletic club at noon. It seemed to him they were uneasy. They had been talking about him then? He was angry. He became belligerent. He not only defended Seneca Doane, but even made fun of the Y.M.C.A. Virgil Gunch was rather brief in his answers. Afterward, Babbitt was not angry. He was afraid. He did not go to the next lunch of the Boosters Club, but hid in a cheap restaurant, and while he munched a ham and egg sandwich and sipped coffee from a cup on the arm of his chair, he worried. 4 days later, when the Bunch were having one of their best parties, Babbitt drove them to the skating rink which had been laid out on the Chaloosa River. After a thaw, the streets had frozen in smooth ice. Down those wide, endless streets the wind rattled between the rows of wooden houses, and the whole Bellevue district seemed a frontier town. Even with skid chains on all 4 wheels, Babbitt was afraid of sliding, and when he came to the long slide of a hill, he crawled down, both brakes on. Slewing around a corner came a less cautious car. It skidded. It almost raked them with its rear fenders. In relief at their escape, the Bunch, Tanis, Minnie, Sontag, Pete, Fulton, Bemis, shouted, "Oh, baby!" and waved their hands to the agitated other driver. Then Babbitt saw Professor Pumphrey laboriously crawling uphill, afoot, staring owlishly at the revelers. He was sure that Pumphrey recognized him and saw Tanis kiss him as she crowed, "You're such a good driver." At lunch the next day he probed Pumphrey with, "Out last night with my brother and some friends of his. Gosh, what driving! Slippery glass. Thought I saw you hiking up the Bellevue Avenue hill." "No, I wasn't. I didn't see you," said Pumphrey hastily, rather guiltily. Perhaps 2 days afterward, Babbitt took Tanis to lunch at the Hotel Thornleigh. She, who had seemed well content to wait for him at her flat, had begun to hint with melancholy smiles that he must think but little of her if he never introduced her to his friends. If he was unwilling to be seen with her except at the movies, he thought of taking her to the ladies' annex of the athletic club, but that was too dangerous. He would have to introduce her, and, oh, people might misunderstand, and he compromised on the Thornleigh. She was unusually smart, all in black, small black tricorn hat, short black caracal coat, loose and swinging, and austere high-necked black velvet frock, at a time when most street costumes were like evening gowns. Perhaps she was too smart. Everyone in the Golden Oak restaurant of the Thornleigh was staring at her as Babbitt followed her to a table. He uneasily hoped that the head waiter would give them a discreet place behind a pillar, but they were stationed on the center aisle. Tanis seemed not to notice her admirers. She smiled at Babbitt with a lavish, "Oh, isn't this nice? What a peppy-looking orchestra." Babbitt had difficulty in being lavish in return, for 2 tables away he saw Vergil Gunch. All through the meal Gunch watched them, while Babbitt watched himself being watched and lugubriously tried to keep from spoiling Tanis's gaiety. "I feel like a spree to-day," she rippled. "I love the Thornleigh, don't you? It's so live and yet so refined." He made talk about the Thornleigh, the service, the food, the people he recognized in the restaurant, all but Vergil Gunch. There did not seem to be anything else to talk of. He smiled conscientiously at her fluttering jests. He agreed with her that Minnie Sonntag was so hard to get along with, and young Pete such a silly, lazy kid, really just no good at all. But he himself had nothing to say. He considered telling her his worries about Gunch, but, oh, gosh, it was too much work to go into the whole thing and explain about Verge and everything. He was relieved when he put Tanis on a trolley. He was cheerful in the familiar simplicities of his office. At 4 o'clock, Vergil Gunch called on him. Babbitt was agitated, but Gunch began in a friendly way. "How's the boy? Say, some of us are getting up a scheme. We'd kind of like to have you come in on." "Fine, Verg, shoot." "You know, during the war we had the undesirable element, the Reds, and walking delegates, and just the plain common grouches, dead to rights. And so did we for quite a while after the war, but folks forgot about the danger, and that gives these cranks a chance to begin working underground again, especially a lot of these parlor socialists. Well, it's up to the folks that do a little sound thinking to make a conscious effort to keep bucking these fellows. Some guy back East has organized a society called the Good Citizens League for just that purpose. Of course, the Chamber of Commerce and the American Legion, and so do a fine work in keeping the decent people in the saddle. But they're devoted to so many other causes that they can't attend to this one problem properly. But the Good Citizens League, the GCL, they stick right to it. Oh, the GCL has to have some other ostensible purposes. For instance, here in Zenith, I think it ought to support the park extension project and the city planning committee. And then, too, it should have a social aspect, being made up of the best people, have dances and so on, especially as one of the best ways it can put the kibosh on cranks is to apply this social boycott business to folks big enough so you can't reach 'em otherwise. Then, if that don't work, the GCL can finally send a little delegation around to inform folks that get too flip that they got to conform to decent standards and quit shooting off their mouths so free. Don't it sound like the organization could do great work? We've already got some of the strongest men in town. And, of course, we want you in. How about it?" Babbitt was uncomfortable. He felt a compulsion back to all the standards he had so vaguely yet so desperately been fleeing. He fumbled, "I suppose you'd specially light on fellows like Seneca Doane and try to make 'em—" "You bet your sweet life we would. Look here, old Georgie, I've never for one moment believed you meant it when you've defended Doane and the strikers and so on at the club. I knew you were simply kidding those poor galoots like Sid Finkelstein. At least I certainly hope you were kidding." "Oh, well, sure, of course you might say." Babbitt was conscious of how feeble he sounded, conscious of Gunch's mature and relentless eye. "Gosh, you know where I stand. I'm no labor agitator. I'm a businessman, first, last, and all the time. But
But honest, I don't think Doane means so badly, and you got to remember he's an old friend of mine."
"George, when it comes right down to a struggle between decency and the security of our homes on the one hand, and red ruin and those lazy dogs plotting for free beer on the other, you got to give up even old friendships. He that is not with me is against me."
I suppose.
"How about it? Going to join us in the Good Citizens League?"
I'll have to think it over, Verge."
"All right, just as you say." Babbitt was relieved to be let off so easy, but Gunch went on. "George, I don't know what's come over you. None of us do. And we've talked a lot about you. For a while we figured out you'd been upset by what happened to poor Riesling, and we forgive you for any fool thing you said, but it's old stuff now, George. We can't make out what's got into you personally. I've always defended you, but I must say it's getting too much for me. All the boys at the athletic club and the boosters are sore. The way you go on deliberately touting Doane and his bunch of hellhounds, and talking about being liberal, which means being wishy-washy, and even saying this preacher guy Ingram isn't a professional free love artist, and then the way you've been carrying on personally. Joe Pumphrey says he saw you out the other night with a gang of totties, all stewed to the gills, and here today coming right into Thornlow with well, she may be all right and a perfect lady, but she certainly did look like a pretty gay skirt for a fellow with his wife out of town to be taken to lunch. Didn't look well. The devil's come over you, George."
Strikes me that there's a lot of fellows that know more about my personal business than I do myself."
"Now don't go getting sore at me because I came out flat-footed like a friend and say what I think instead of tattling behind your back the way a whole lot of 'em do. Tell you, George, you got a position in the community, and the community expects you to live up to it, and better think over joining the Good Citizens League. See about it later." He was gone. That evening Babbitt dined alone. He saw all the clan of good fellows peering through the restaurant windows, spying on him. Fear sat beside him, and he told himself that tonight he would not go to Tanis's flat. And he did not go till late. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 30. 1. The summer before, Mrs. Babbitt's letters had cracked with desire to return to Zenith. Now they said nothing of returning, but a wistful, "I suppose everything is going to be all right without me," among her dry chronicles of weather and sickness, hinted to Babbitt that he hadn't been very urgent about her coming. He worried it.
"If she were here and I went on raising Cain like I've been doing, she'd have a fit. I got to get hold of myself. I got to learn to play around and yet not make a fool of myself. I can do it, too. Folks like Verge Gunch let me alone and Myra'll stay away, but poor kid, she sounds lonely. Lord, I don't want to hurt her."
Impulsively he wrote that they missed her, and her next letter said happily that she was coming home. He persuaded himself that he was eager to see her. He bought roses for the house. He ordered squab for dinner. He had the car cleaned and polished. All the way home from the station with her he was adequate in his accounts of Ted's success in basket-ball at the university. But before they reached Floral Heights there was nothing more to say, and already he felt the force of her stolidity, wondered whether he could remain a good husband and still sneak out of the house this evening for half an hour with the bunch. When he had housed the car, he blundered upstairs into the familiar talcum-scented warmth of her presence, blaring, "Help you unpack your bag?" "No, I can do it." Slowly she turned, holding up a small box, and slowly she said, "I brought you a present, just a new cigar case. I didn't know if you'd care to have it." She was the lonely girl, the brown, appealing Myra Thompson, whom he had married, and he almost wept for pity as he kissed her and besought, "Oh, honey, care to have it? Course I do. I'm awful proud you brought it to me, and I needed a new case badly." He wondered how he would get rid of the case he had bought the week before. "And you really are glad to see me back?"
Why, you poor kitty, what you been worrying about?
"Well, you didn't seem to miss me very much." By the time he had finished his stint of lying, they were firmly bound again. By 10 that evening it seemed improbable that she had ever been away. There was but one difference, the problem of remaining a respectable husband, a Floral Heights husband, yet seeing Tanis and the Bunch with frequency. He had promised to telephone to Tanis that evening, and now it was melodramatically impossible. He prowled about the telephone, impulsively thrusting out a hand to lift the receiver, but never quite daring to risk it. Nor could he find a reason for slipping down to the drugstore on Smith Street, with its telephone booth. He was laden with responsibility till he threw it off with the speculation,
Why the deuce should I fret so about being able to phone Tanis? She can get along without me. I don't owe her anything. She's a fine girl, but I've given her just as much as she has me. Oh, damn these women and the way they get all tied up in complications.
2. For a week he was attentive to his wife, took her to the theater, to dinner at the Littlefields. Then the old weary dodging and shifting began, and at least 2 evenings a week he spent with the Bunch. He still made pretense of going to the Elks and to committee meetings, but less and less did he trouble to have his excuses interesting, less and less did she affect to believe him. He was certain that she knew he was associating with what Floral Heights called a sporty crowd, yet neither of them acknowledged it. In matrimonial geography, the distance between the first mute recognition of a break and the admission thereof is as great as the distance between the first naive faith and the first doubting. As he began to drift away, he also began to see her as a human being, to like and dislike her instead of accepting her as a comparatively movable part of the furniture, and he compassionated that husband and wife relation which, in 25 years of married life, had become a separate and real entity. He recalled their highlights, the summer vacation in Virginia meadows under the blue wall of the mountains, their motor tour through Ohio, and the exploration of Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, the birth of Verona, their building of this new house, planned to comfort them through a happy old age. Chokingly, they had said that it might be the last home either of them would ever have. Yet his most softening remembrance of these dear moments did not keep him from barking at dinner,
Yep, going out a few hours. Don't sit up for me.
He did not dare now to come home drunk, and though he rejoiced in his return to high morality and spoke with gravity to Pete and Fulton Bemis about their drinking, he prickled at Myra's unexpressed criticisms and sulkily meditated that a fellow couldn't ever learn to handle himself if he was always bossed by a lot of women. He no longer wondered if Tanis wasn't a bit worn and sentimental. In contrast to the complacent Myra, he saw her as swift and airborne and radiant, a fire spirit, tenderly stooping to the hearth. And however pitifully he brooded on his wife, he longed to be with Tanis. Then Mrs. Babbitt tore the decent cloak from her unhappiness, and the astounded male discovered that she was having a small, determined rebellion of her own. 3. They were beside the fireless fireplace in the evening. "Georgie," she said, "you haven't given me the list of your household expenses while I was away."
No, I haven't. Haven't made it out yet.
Very affably.
Gosh, we must try to keep down expenses this year.
That's so. I don't know where all the money goes. I try to economize, but it just seems to evaporate.
I suppose I oughtn't to spend so much on cigars. Don't know but what I'll cut down my smoking, maybe cut it out entirely. I was thinking of a good way to do it the other day. Start on these cheroot cigarettes, and they'd kind of disgust me with smoking."
"Oh, I do wish you would. It isn't that I care, but honestly, George, it is so bad for you to smoke so much. Don't you think you could reduce the amount? And, George, I notice now when you come home from these lodging and all, and sometimes you smell of whiskey. Dearie, you know I don't worry so much about the moral side of it, but you have a weak stomach, and you can't stand all this drinking."
"Weak stomach, hell! I guess I can carry my booze about as well as most folks."
"Well, I do think you ought to be careful. Don't you see, dear? I don't want you to get sick."
"Sick rats! I'm not a baby. I guess I ain't going to get sick just because maybe once a week I shoot a highball. That's the trouble with women. They always exaggerate so."
"George, I don't think you ought to talk that way when I'm just speaking for your own good."
I know, but gosh, all fishhooks, that's the trouble with women. They're always criticizing and commenting and bringing things up, and then they say it's for your own good.
"Why, George, that's not a nice way to talk, to answer me so short."
Well, I didn't mean to answer short, but gosh, talking as if I was a kindergarten brat not able to tote one highball without calling for the St. Mary's ambulance. Fine idea you must have of me.
"Oh, it isn't that. It's just I don't want to see you get sick, and I didn't know it was so late. Don't forget to give me those household accounts for the time while I was away."
Oh, thunder, what's the use of taking the trouble to make 'em now? Let's just skip 'em for that period.
"Why, George Babbitt, in all the years we've been married, we've never failed to keep a complete account of every penny we've spent."
No, maybe that's the trouble with us.
"What in the world do you mean?"
Well, I don't mean anything, only sometimes I get so darn sick and tired of all the routine and the accounting at the office and expenses at home and fussing and stewing and fretting and wearing myself out, worrying over a lot of junk that doesn't really mean a doggone thing, and being so careful and good Lord, what do you think I'm made for? I could have been a darn good orator, and here I fuss and fret and worry.
"Don't you suppose I ever get tired of fussing? I get so bored with ordering 3 meals a day, 365 days a year, and ruining my eyes over that horrid sewing machine, and looking after your clothes, and Roan's and Ted's and Tinka's and everybody's in the laundry, darning socks, and going down to the Piggy Wiggly to market and bringing my basket home to save money on the cash and carry in. Everything."
Oh, gosh, with a certain astonishment. I suppose maybe you do, but talk about here I have to be in the office every single day while you can go out all afternoon and see folks and visit with the neighbors and do any blinking thing you want to.
Yes, and a fine lot of good that does me, just talking over the same old things with the same old crowd, while you have all sorts of interesting people coming in to see you at the office."
Interesting. Cranky old dames that want to know why I haven't rented their dear precious homes for about 7 times their value. Bunch of old crabs, panning the everlasting daylights out of me because they don't receive every cent of their rentals by 3 GM on the 2nd of the month. Sure, interesting. Just as interesting as the smallpox.
"Now, George, I will not have you shouting at me that way."
Well, it gets my goat the way women figure out that a man doesn't do a darn thing but sit in his chair and have lovey-dovey conferences with a lot of classy dames and give 'em the glad eye.
"I guess you manage to give them a glad enough eye when they do come in."
What do you mean? Mean I'm chasing flappers?
"I should hope not at your age."
Now you look here. You may not believe it. Of course, all you see is fat little George Babbitt. Sure, handyman around the house, fixes a furnace when the furnace man doesn't show up, pays the bills, but dull, awful dull. Well, you may not believe it, but there's some women that think old George Babbitt isn't such a bad scout. They think he's not so bad looking, not so bad that it hurts anyway, and he's got a pretty good line of guff, and some of them even think he shakes a darn wicked walkover at dancing.
"Yes," she spoke slowly, "I haven't much doubt of that. When I'm away, you manage to find people who properly appreciate you."
Well, I just mean, he protested with a sound of denial.
Then he was angered into semi-honesty.
You bet I do. I find plenty of folks, and doggone nice ones, that don't think I'm a weak-stomached baby.
That's exactly what I was saying. You can run around with anybody you please, but I'm supposed to sit here and wait for you? You have the chance to get all the sorts of culture and everything, and I just stay home.
Well, gosh almighty, there's nothing to prevent your reading books and going to lectures and all that junk, is there?
George, I told you I won't have you shouting at me like that. I don't know what's come over you. You never used to speak to me in this cranky way.
I didn't mean to sound cranky, but gosh, it certainly makes me sort of get the blame because you don't keep up with things.
I'm going to. Will you help me?
Sure, anything I can do to help you in the culture-grabbing line. Yours to oblige, G. F. Babbitt.
Very well, then. I want you to go to Miss Mudge's New Thought meeting with me next Sunday afternoon.
Who, which?
Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge, the field lecturer for the American New Thought League. She's going to speak on cultivating the sun spirit before the League of her Higher Illumination at the Thornleigh.
Oh, punk. New thought, hashed thought, and a poached egg. Cultivating it sounds like why is a mouse when it spins. That's a fine spiel for a good Presbyterian to be going to, when you can hear Doc Drew.
Reverend Drew is a scholar and a pulpit orator and all that, but he hasn't got the inner ferment, as Miss Mudge calls it. He hasn't any inspiration for the new era. Women need inspiration now. So I want you to come, as you promised.
4. The Zenith branch of the League of the Higher Illumination met in the smaller ballroom of the Hotel Thornleigh, a refined apartment with pale green walls and plaster wreaths of roses, refined parquet flooring, and ultra-refined frail gilt chairs. Here were gathered 65 women and 10 men. Most of the men slouched in their chairs and wiggled, while their wives sat rigidly at attention. But 2 of them, red-necked meaty men, were as respectably devout as their wives. They were newly rich contractors who, having bought houses, motors, hand-painted pictures, and gentlemanness, were now buying a refined, ready-made philosophy. It had been a toss-up with them whether to buy New Thought, Christian Science, or a good standard high church model of Episcopalianism. In the flesh, Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge fell somewhat short of a prophetic aspect. She was pony-built and plump, with the face of a haughty Pekingese, a button of a nose, and arms so short that despite her most indignant endeavors, she could not clasp her hands in front of her as she sat on the platform waiting. Her frock of taffeta and green velvet, with 3 strings of glass beads and large folding eyeglasses dangling from a black ribbon, was a triumph of refinement. Mrs. Mudge was introduced by the president of the League of the Higher Illumination, an oldish young woman with a yearning voice, white spats, and a mustache. She said that Mrs. Mudge would now make it plain to the simplest intellect how the sun spirit could be cultivated, and they who had been thinking about cultivating one would do well to treasure Mrs. Mudge's words, because even Zenith, and everybody knew that Zenith stood in the van of spiritual and New Thought progress, didn't often have the opportunities to sit at the feet of such an inspiring optimist and metaphysical seer as Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge, who had lived the life of wider usefulness through concentration, and in the silence found those secrets of mental control and the inner key which were immediately going to transform and bring peace, power, and prosperity to the unhappy nations. And so, friends, would they, for this precious gem-studded hour, forget the illusions of the seeming real, and in the actualization of the deep-lying veritas pass along with Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge to the realm beautiful. If Mrs. Mudge was rather pudgier than one would like one's swamis, yogis, seers, and initiates, yet her voice had the real professional note. It was refined and optimistic. It was overpoweringly calm. It flowed on relentlessly without one comma till Babbitt was hypnotized. Her favorite word was always, which she pronounced always. Her principal gesture was a pontifical but thoroughly ladylike
blessing with two stubby fingers. She explained about this matter of spiritual saturation. There are those. Of those she made a linked sweetness long drawn out, a far-off delicate call in a twilight minor. It chastely rebuked the restless husbands, yet brought them a message of healing. There are those who have seen the rim and outer seaming of the Logos. There are those who have glimpsed and enthusiasm possessed themselves of some segment and portion of the Logos. There are those who thus flicked, but not penetrated, and radioactivated by the dynamis, go always to and fro, assertative that they possess and are possessed of the Logos and the metempsychos. But the word I bring you this concept, I enlarge that those that are not utter are not even inceptive, and that holiness is in its definitive essence always, always, always wholeness. And it proved that the essence of the Sun Spirit was truth, but its aura and effixion were cheerfulness. Face always the day with the dawn laugh, with the enthusiasm of the initiate, who perceives that all works together in the revolutions of the wheel, and whose answers the strictures of the soured souls of the destructionists with a glad affirmation. It went on for about an hour and 7 minutes. At the end, Mrs. Mudge spoke with more vigor and punctuation. Now let me suggest to all of you the advantages of the Theosophical and Pantheistic Oriental Reading Circle, which I represent. Our object is to unite all the manifestations of the new era into one cohesive whole: New Thought, Christian Science, Theosophy, Vedanta, Bahaism, and the other sparks from one new light. The subscription is but $10 a year, and for this mere pittance the members receive not only the monthly magazine, Pearls of Healing, but the privilege of sending right to the President, our Reverend Mother Dobbs, any question regarding spiritual progress, matrimonial problems, health and well-being questions, financial difficulties, and they listened to her with adoring attention. They looked genteel. They looked ironed out. They coughed politely and crossed their legs with quietness. And in expensive linen handkerchiefs they blew their noses with a delicacy altogether optimistic and refined. As for Babbitt, he sat and suffered. When they were blessedly out in the air again, when they drove home through a wind smelling of snow and honest sun, he dared not speak. They had been too near to quarreling these days. Mrs. Babbitt forced it. "Did you enjoy Mrs. Mudge's talk?"
What did you get out of it?"
"Oh, it starts a person thinking. It gets you out of a routine of ordinary thoughts."
"Well, I'll hand it to Opal. She isn't ordinary, but gosh, honest, did that stuff mean anything to you?"
"Of course. I'm not trained in metaphysics, and there was lots I couldn't quite grasp, but I feel it was inspiring. And she speaks so readily. I do think you ought to have got something out of it."
"Well, I didn't. I swear I was simply astonished the way those women lapped it up. Why the dickens they want to put in their time listening to all that blah when they—"
"It's certainly better for them than going to roadhouses and smoking and drinking."
"I don't know whether it is or not. Personally, I don't see a whole lot of difference. In both cases they're trying to get away from themselves. Most everybody is, these days, I guess. And I certainly got a whole lot more out of hoofing in a good lively dance, even in some dive, than sitting looking at my collar that was too tight, and feeling too scared to spit, and listening to Opal chewing her words."
"I'm sure you do. You're very fond of dives, no doubt. You saw a lot of them while I was away."
"Look here. You've been doing a hell of a lot of insinuating and hinting about lately, as if I were leading a double life or something. And I'm damn sick of it, and I don't want to hear anything more about it."
"Why, George Babbitt, do you realize what you're saying? Why, George, in all our years together you've never talked to me like that."
"It's about time, then.
Lately you've been getting worse and worse, and now finally you're cursing and swearing at me and shouting at me, and your voice is so ugly and hateful I just shudder."
"Aw, rats, quit exaggerating. I wasn't shouting or swearing either."
"I wish you could hear your own voice. Maybe you don't realize how it sounds, but even so, you never used to talk like that. You simply couldn't talk this way if something dreadful didn't happen to you." His mind was hard. With amazement he found that he wasn't particularly sorry. It was only with an effort that he made himself more agreeable.
"Well, gosh, I don't mean to get sore."
"George, do you realize that we can't go on like this, getting further and farther apart, and you ruder and ruder to me? I just don't know what's going to happen."
He had a moment's pity for her bewilderment. He thought of how many deep and tender things
Would be hurt if they really couldn't go on like this. But his pity was impersonal, and he was wondering,
wouldn't it maybe be a good thing if, not a divorce and all that, of course, but kind of a little more independence?
While she looked at him pleadingly, he drove on in a dreadful silence. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Babbitt. The Sleepervox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 31. 1. When he was away from her, while he kicked about the garage and swept the snow off the running board and examined a cracked hose connection, he repented. He was alarmed and astonished that he could have flared out at his wife, and thought fondly how much more lasting she was than the flighty bunch.
He went in to mumble that he was sorry and didn't mean to be grouchy,
and to inquire as to her interest in a movie. But in the darkness of the movie theater he brooded
that he'd gone and tied himself up to Myra all over again.
He had some satisfaction in taking it out on Tanis Judique.
Hang Tanis, anyway. Why, she'd gone and got him into these mix-ups, made him all jumpy, nervous, and cranky. Too many complications. Cut him out.
He wanted peace. For 10 days he did not see Tanis nor telephone to her, and instantly she put upon him the compulsion which he hated. When he had stayed away from her for 5 days, hourly taking pride in his resoluteness, and hourly picturing how greatly Tanis must miss him, Miss McGowan reported, "Miss Judique on the phone. Like to speak to you about some repairs." Tanis was quick and quiet. "Mr. Babbitt? Oh, George, this is Tanis. I haven't seen you for weeks, days, anyway. You aren't sick, are you?"
"No, just been terribly rushed. I think there'll be a big revival of building this year. Got to work hard."
"Of course, my man, I want you to. You know I'm terribly ambitious for you, much more than I am for myself. I just don't want you to forget poor Tanis. Will you call me up soon?"
Sure, you bet."
"Please do. I shan't call you again." He mediated.
"Poor kid. But gosh, she oughtn't to phone me at the office. She's a wonder sympathy ambitious for me. But gosh, I won't be made and compelled to call her up till I get ready. Darn these women, the way they make demands. It'll be one long old time before I see her. But gosh, I'd like to see her tonight. Sweet little thing. Cut that, son. Now you've broken away. Be wise."
She did not telephone him again, nor he, but after 5 more days she wrote to him. "Have I offended you? You must know, dear, I didn't mean to. I'm so lonely, and I need somebody to cheer me up. Why didn't you come to the nice party we had at Carrie's last evening? I remember she invited you. Can't you come around here tomorrow, Thursday evening? I shall be alone and hope to see you." His reflections were numerous.
Doggone it, why can't she let me alone?
Why can't women ever learn a fellow hates to be bulldozed, and they always take advantage of you by yelling how lonely they are?
Now, it isn't nice of you, young fella. She's a fine, square, straight girl, and she does get lonely. She writes a swell hand. Nice-looking stationery. Plain, refined. I guess I'll have to go see her. Well, thank God I got till tomorrow night free of her. Anyway, she's nice, but hang it, I won't be made to do things. I'm not married to her, nor by golly gonna be. Oh, rats! I suppose I better go see her. 2. Thursday, the tomorrow of Tanis's note, was full of emotional crises. At the Roughnecks' table at the club, Verg Gunch talked of the Good Citizens League, and it seemed to Babbitt deliberately left him out of the invitations to join old Matt Penniman, and the general utility man at Babbitt's office had troubles and came in to groan about them. The oldest boy was no good, his wife was sick, and he had quarreled with his brother-in-law. Conrad Lyte also had troubles, and since Lyte was one of his best clients, Babbitt had to listen to him. Mr. Lyte, it appeared, was suffering from a peculiarly interesting neuralgia, and the garage had overcharged him. When Babbitt came home, everybody had troubles. His wife was simultaneously thinking about discharging the impudent new maid and worried lest the maid leave, and Tinka desired to denounce her teacher. "Oh, quit fussing," Babbitt fussed. "You never hear me whining about my troubles, and yet if you had to run a real estate office, why, today I found Miss Bannigan was 2 days behind with her accounts, and I pinched my finger in my desk, and Lyte was in and just as unreasonable as ever." He was so vexed that after dinner, when it was time for a tactful escape to Tanis, he merely grumped to his wife, "Gotta go out. Be back by 11, should think." "Oh, you're going out again?" "Again? What do you mean again? Haven't hardly been out of the house for a week." Are you going to the Elks?" "Nope. Got to see some people." Though this time he heard his own voice and knew that it was curt, though she was looking at him with wide-eyed reproach, he stumped into the hall, jerked on his ulster and fur-lined gloves, and went out to start the car. He was relieved to find Tanis cheerful, unreproachful, and brilliant in a frock of brown net over gold tissue. "You poor man, having to come out on a night like this. It's terribly cold. Don't you think a small highball would be nice?" "Now, by golly, there's a woman with savvy. I think we could more or less stand a highball if it wasn't too tall of a one. Not more than a foot tall." He kissed her with careless heartiness. He forgot the compulsion of her demands. He stretched in a large chair and felt that he had beautifully come home. He was suddenly loquacious. He told her what a noble and misunderstood man he was, and how superior to Pete, Fulton Bemis, and the other men of their acquaintance, and she, bending forward, chin and charming hand, brightly agreed. But when he forced himself to ask, "Well, honey, how's things with you?" she took his duty question seriously, and he discovered that she too had troubles. "Oh, all right, but I did get so angry with Carrie. She told Minnie that I told her that Minnie was an awful tightwad, and Minnie told me Carrie had told her, and of course I told her I hadn't said anything of the kind, and then Carrie found Minnie had told me, and she was simply furious because Minnie had told me, and of course I was just boiling because Carrie had told her I'd told her, and then we all met up at Fulton's. His wife is away, thank heavens. Oh, there's the dandiest floor in his house to dance on, and we were all of us simply furious at each other, and oh, I do hate that kind of a mix-up, don't you? I mean, it's so lacking in refinement, but and Mother wants to come and stay with me for a whole month, and of course I do love her, I suppose I do, but honestly, she'll cramp my style something dreadful. She never can learn not to comment, and she always wants to know where I'm going when I go out evenings. And if I lie to her, she always spies around and ferrets around and finds out where I've been. And then she looks like Patience on a monument, till I could just scream. And oh, I must tell you, you know I never talk about myself. I just hate people who do, don't you? But I feel so stupid tonight, and I know I must be boring you with all this. What would you do about Mother?" He gave her facile masculine advice. She was to put off her mother's stay.
She was to tell Carrie to go to the deuce. For these valuable revelations she thanked him, and they ambled into the familiar gossip of the bunch, of what a sentimental fool was Carrie, of what a lazy brat was Pete, of how nice Fulton Bemis could be. Of course, lots of people think he's a regular old grouch when they meet him because he doesn't give 'em the glad hand the first crack out of the box, but when they get to know him, he's a corker. But as they had gone conscientiously through each of these analyses before the conversation staggered, Babbitt tried to be intellectual and deal with general topics. He said some thoroughly sound things about disarmament and broad-mindedness and liberalism, but it seemed to him that general topics interested Tanis only when she could apply them to Pete, Carrie, or themselves. He was distressingly conscious of their silence. He tried to stir her into chatting again, but silence rose like a gray presence and hovered between them. He labored. It strikes me that unemployment is lessening. Maybe Pete will get a decent job then. Silence. Desperately he essayed, "What's the trouble, old honey? You seem kind of quiet tonight." "Am I? Oh, I'm not, but do you really care whether I am or not?" "Care? Sure, of course I do." "Do you really?" She swooped on him, sat on the arm of his chair. He halted the emotional drain of having to appear fond of her. He stroked her hand, smiling up at her dutifully, and sank back. "George, I wonder if you really like me at all?" "Course I do, silly." "Do you really, precious? Do you care a bit?" "Well, certainly. You don't suppose I'd be here if I didn't." "Now, see here, young man, I won't have you speaking to me in that huffy way." "I didn't mean to sound huffy. I just—" In injured and rather childish tones, "Gosh almighty, it makes me tired the way everybody says I sound huffy when I just talk natural. Do they expect me to sing it or something?" "Who do you mean by everybody? How many other ladies have you been consoling?" "Look here, and I won't have this hinting." Humbly, "I know, dear. I was only teasing. I know I didn't mean to talk huffy. It was just tired. Forgive bad Tanis. But say you love me. Say it." "Love you. Of course I do." "Yes, you do." Cynically. "Oh, darling, I don't mean to be rude, but I get so lonely. I feel so useless. Nobody needs me. Nothing I can do for anybody. And you know, dear, I'm so active I could be if there was something to do. And I am young, aren't I? I'm not an old thing. I'm not old and stupid, am I?" He had to assure her. She stroked his hair, and he had to look pleased under that touch, the more demanding in its beguiling softness. He was impatient. He wanted to flee out to a hard, sure, unemotional man-world. Through her delicate and caressing fingers she may have caught something of his shrugging distaste. She left him. He was, for the moment, buoyantly relieved. She dragged a footstool to his feet and sat looking beseechingly up at him. But, as in many men, the cringing of a dog, the flinching of a frightened child, roused not pity but a surprised and jerky cruelty. So her humility only annoyed him, and he saw her now as middle-aged, as beginning to be old. Even while he detested his own thoughts, they rode him. She was old. He winced. Old. He noted how the soft flesh was creasing into webby folds beneath her chin, below her eyes, at the base of her wrists. A patch of her throat had a minute roughness, like the crumbs from a rubber eraser. Old. She was younger in years than himself, yet it was sickening to have her yearning up to him with rolling great eyes, as if, he shuddered, his own aunt were making love to him. He fretted inwardly. "I'm through with this asinine fooling around. I'm going to cut her out. She's a darn decent, nice woman, and I don't want to hurt her, but it'll hurt her a lot less to cut her right out, like a good, clean surgical operation." He was on his feet. He was speaking urgently. By every rule of self-esteem he had to prove to her and to himself that it was her fault.
I suppose maybe I'm kind of out of sorts tonight, but honest, honey, when I stayed away for a while to catch up on work and everything and figure out where I was at, you ought to have been cannier and waited till I came back. Can't you see, dear, when you made me come, I being about an average bull-headed chump, my tendency was to resist. Listen, dear, I'm going now."
"Not for a while, precious? No?"
"Yep, right now. And then sometime we'll see about the future."
"What do you mean, dear, about the future? Have I done something I oughtn't to? Oh, I'm so dreadfully sorry."
He resolutely put his hands behind him. "Not a thing. God bless you, not a thing. You're as good as they make 'em, but it's just, good Lord, do you realize I've got things to do in the world? I've got a business to attend to, and you might not believe it, but I've got a wife and kids that I'm awfully fond of."
Then only during the murder he was committing was he able to feel nobly virtuous.
"I want us to be friends, but gosh, I can't go on this way feeling I got to come up here every so often."
"Oh, darling, darling, and I've always told you so carefully that you were absolutely free. I just wanted you to come around when you were tired and wanted to talk to me, or when you could enjoy our parties." She was so reasonable. She was so gently right. It took him an hour to make his escape, with nothing settled and everything horribly settled. In a barren freedom of icy northern wind he sighed, "Thank God it's over. Poor Tanis, poor darling decent Tanis. But it is over. Absolute. I'm free." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt, by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 32. 1. His wife was up when he came in. "You have a good time?" she sniffed.
"I had not had a rotten time. Anything else I got to explain?"
"George, how can you speak like that? Oh, I don't know what's come over you."
"Good Lord, there's nothing come over me. Why do you look for trouble all the time?"
He was warning himself.
"Careful, stop being so disagreeable. Course she feels it, being left alone here all evening."
But he forgot his warning as she went on. "Why do you go out and see all sorts of strange people? I suppose you'll say you've been to another committee meeting this evening."
"Nope. I've been calling on a woman. We sat by the fire and kidded each other and had a whale of a good time, if you want to know."
"Well, from the way you say it, I suppose it's my fault you went there. I probably sent you."
"You did."
"Well, upon my word."
"You hate strange people, as you call 'em. If you had your way, I'd be as much of a old stick in the mud as Howard Littlefield. You never want to have anybody with any git at the house. You want a bunch of old stiffs that sit around and gas about the weather. You're doing your level best to make me old. Well, let me tell you, I'm not going to have—"
Overwhelmed, she bent to his unprecedented tirade, and in answer she mourned, "Oh, dearest, I don't think that's true. I don't mean to make you old. I know perhaps you're partly right. Perhaps I am slow about getting acquainted with new people. But when you think of all the dear good times we have, and the supper parties and the movies and all—" With true masculine wiles, he not only convinced himself that she had injured him, but, by the loudness of his voice and the brutality of his attack, he convinced her also. And presently he had her apologizing for his having spent the evening with Tanis. He went up to bed well pleased, not only the master but the martyr of the household. For a distasteful moment after he had lain down, he wondered if he had been altogether just.
"Ought to be ashamed bullying her. Maybe there is her side to things. Maybe she hasn't had such a bloomin' hectic time herself. But I don't care. Good for her to get waked up a little. And I'm going to keep free of her and Tanis and the fellows at the club and everybody. I'm going to run my own life."
2.
In this mood he was particularly objectionable at the Boosters' Club lunch next day. They were addressed by a congressman who had just returned from an exhaustive 3-month study of the finances, ethnology, political systems, linguistic divisions, mineral resources, and agricultures of Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. He told them all about those subjects, together with 3 funny stories about European misconceptions of America, and some spirited words on the necessity of keeping ignorant foreigners out of America. "Say, that was a mighty informative talk. Real he stuff," said Sidney Finkelstein. But the dissatisfied Babbitt grumbled, "Four-flusher. Bunch of hot air. And what's the matter with immigrants? Gosh, they aren't all ignorant, and I got a hunch we're all descended from immigrants ourselves." "How you make me tired," said Mr. Finkelstein. Babbitt was aware that Dr. A.I. Dilling was sternly listening from across the table. Dr. Dilling was one of the most important men in the Boosters. He was not a physician, but a surgeon, a more romantic and sounding occupation. He was an intense, large man with a boiling of black hair and a thick black mustache. The newspapers often chronicled his operations. He was professor of surgery in the State University. He went to dinner at the very best houses on Royal Ridge, and he was said to be worth several $100,000. It was dismaying to Babbitt to have such a person glower at him. He hastily praised the congressman's wit to Sidney Finkelstein, but for Dr. Dilling's benefit. 3. That afternoon 3 men shouldered into Babbitt's office with the air of a vigilante committee in frontier days. They were large, resolute, big-jawed men, and they were all high lords in a land of zenith. Dr. Dilling the surgeon, Charles McKelvey the contractor, and most dismaying of all, the white-bearded Colonel Rutherford Snow, owner of the Advocate-Times. In their whelming presence Babbitt felt small and insignificant. Well, great pleasure. Have chairs. What can I do for you?" he babbled. They neither sat nor offered observations on the weather. "Babbitt," said Colonel Snow, "we've come from the Good Citizens League. We've decided we want you to join. Virgil Gunch says you don't care to, but I think we can show you a new light. The League is going to combine with the Chamber of Commerce in a campaign for the open shop, so it's time for you to put your name down." In his embarrassment Babbitt could not recall his reasons for not wishing to join the League, if indeed he had ever definitely known them. But he was passionately certain that he did not wish to join, and at the thought of their forcing him he felt a stirring of anger against even these princes of commerce. "Sorry, Colonel. Have to think it over for a little," he mumbled. McKelvey snarled, "That means you're not going to join, George." Something black and unfamiliar and ferocious spoke from Babbitt. "Hey, look here, Charlie, I'm damned as if I'm going to be bullied into joining anything, not even by you plutes." "We're not bullying anybody," Dr. Dillon began, but Colonel Snow thrust him aside with, "Certainly we are. We don't mind a little bullying if it's necessary. Babbitt, the GCL has been talking about you a good deal. You're supposed to be a sensible, clean, responsible man. You always have been. But here lately, for God knows what reason, I hear from all sorts of sources that you're running around with a loose crowd, and what's a whole lot worse, you've actually been advocating and supporting some of the most dangerous elements in town, like this fellow Doane." "Colonel, that strikes me as my private business." "Possibly, but we want to have an understanding. You've stood in, you and your father-in-law, with some of the most substantial and forward-looking interests in town, like my friends at the Street Traction Company, and my papers have given you a lot of good boost. Well, you can't expect the decent citizens to go on aiding you if you intend to side with precisely the people who are trying to undermine us." Babbitt was frightened, but he had an agonized instinct that if he yielded in this he would yield in everything. He protested. "You're exaggerating, Colonel. I believe in being broad-minded and liberal, but of course I'm just as much against the cranks and black skirts and labor unions and so on as you are. But fact is, I belong to so many organizations now that I can't do 'em justice, and I want to think her over before I decide about coming into the GCL."
Colonel Snow condescended.
"Oh, no, I'm not exaggerating. Why, the doctor here heard you cussing out and defaming one of the finest types of Republican congressman just this noon, and you have entirely the wrong idea about thinking over joining. We're not begging you to join the GCL. We're permitting you to join."
"I'm not sure, my boy. But what if you put it off? It'll be too late. I'm not sure we'll want you then."
"Better think quick. Better think quick."
The three vigilantes, formidable in their righteousness, stared at him in a taut silence. Babbitt waded through. He thought nothing at all. He merely waited, while in his echoing head buzzed,
"I don't want to join. I don't want to join. I don't want to."
"All right, sorry for you," said Colonel Snow, and the three men abruptly turned their beefy backs. 4. As Babbitt went out to his car that evening, he saw Vergil Gunch coming down the block. He raised his hand in salutation, but Gunch ignored it and crossed the street. He was certain that Gunch had seen him. He drove home in sharp discomfort. His wife attacked at once. "Georgie, dear, Muriel Fink was in this afternoon, and she says that Chum says the committee of this Good Citizens League especially asked you to join, and you wouldn't. Don't you think it would be better? You know all the nicest people belong, and the League stands for—"
"I know what the League stands for. It stands for the suppression of free speech and free thought and everything else. I don't propose to be bullied and rushed into joining anything, and it isn't a question of whether it's a good league or a bad league, or what the hell kind of a league it is. It's just a question of my refusing to be told I got to—"
"But, dear, if you don't join, people might criticize you."
"Let 'em criticize."
"But I mean nice people."
"Rats! Matter of fact, this whole league is a fad. It's like all those other organizations that start off with such a rush and let on they're going to change the whole works. Pretty soon they peter out and everybody forgets all about 'em."
"But if that's the fad now, don't you think you—"
"No, I don't. Oh, Myra, please quit nagging me about it. I'm sick of hearing about the confounded GCL. I almost wish I'd joined them when Verge first came around. Got it over. Maybe I'd have come in today if the committee hadn't tried to bullyrag me. But by God, as long as I'm a free, born, independent American
Now, George, you're talking exactly like the German furnace man."
"Oh, I am I? Then I won't talk at all."
He longed that evening to see Tanis Judique, to be strengthened by her sympathy. When the family were upstairs, he got as far as telephoning to her apartment house, but he was agitated about it when the janitor answered. He blurted,
"Never mind, I'll call later,"
and hung up the receiver. 5. If Babbitt had not been certain about Vergil Gunch's avoiding him, there could be little doubt about William Washington Eathorne next morning. When Babbitt was driving down to the office, he overtook Eathorne's car, with the great banker sitting in anemic solemnity behind the chauffeur. Babbitt waved at him and cried, "Mornin'!" Eathorne looked at him deliberately, hesitated, and gave him a nod more contemptuous than a direct cut. Babbitt's partner and father-in-law came in at 10. "George, what's this I hear about some song and dance you gave Colonel Snow about not wanting to join the GCL? What the dickens you trying to do? Wreck the firm? You don't suppose those big guns will stand for your bucking them and springing all this liberal poppycock you've been getting off lately, do you?"
"Oh, rats, Henry T. You've been reading bum fiction. There ain't any such a thing as these plots to keep folks from being liberal. This is a free country. Man can do anything he wants to do."
"Course, there ain't any plots. Who said they was? Only if folks got an idea you're scatterbrained and unstable, you don't suppose they'll want to do business with you, do you? One little rumor about your being a crank would do more to ruin this business than all the plots and stuff that these fool story writers could think up in a month of Sundays." That afternoon, when the old reliable Conrad Lighty, the merry miser, Conrad Lighty, appeared, and Babbitt suggested his buying a parcel of land in the new residential section of Dorchester, Lighty said hastily, too hastily, "No, don't want to go into anything new just now." A week later, Babbitt learned through Henry Thompson that the officials of the Street Traction Company were planning another real estate coup, and that Sanders, Torrey, and Wing, not the Babbitt-Thompson Company, were to handle it for them.
I figure that Jake Offutt is kind of leery about the way folks are talking about you. Of course, Jake is a rock-ribbed or old diehard, and he probably advised the Traction fellows to get some other broker. George, you got to do something, trembled Thompson.
And in a rush, Babbitt agreed. All nonsense the way the people misjudged him, but still, he determined to join the Good Citizens League the next time he was asked, and in a furious resignation he waited. He wasn't asked. They ignored him. He did not have the courage to go to the League and beg in, and he took refuge in a shaky boast that he had
gotten away with bucking the whole city. Nobody could dictate to him how he was going to think and act.
He was jarred as by nothing else when the paragon of stenographers, Miss McGowan, suddenly left him. Though her reasons were excellent, she needed a rest, her sister was sick, she might not do any more work for 6 months. He was uncomfortable with her successor, Miss Havstad. What Miss Havstad's given name was, no one in the office ever knew. It seemed improbable that she had a given name. A lover, a powder puff, or a digestion. She was so impersonal, this slight, pale, industrious Swede, that it was vulgar to think of her as going to an ordinary home to eat hash. She was a perfectly oiled and enameled machine, and she ought, each evening, to have been dusted off and shut in her desk, beside her too slim, too frail pencil points. She took dictation swiftly, her typing was perfect, but Babbitt became jumpy when he tried to work with her. She made him feel puffy, and at his best beloved daily jokes she looked gently inquiring. He longed for Miss McGowan's return, and thought of writing to her. Then he heard that Miss McGowan had, a week after leaving him, gone over to his dangerous competitors, Sanders, Torrey, and Wing. He was not merely annoyed, he was frightened.
"Why'd you quit, then?" he worried. "Did she have a hunch my business is going on the rocks? And it was Sanders got the Street Traction deal. Rats, sinking ship."
Gray fear loomed always by him now. He watched Fritz Wellinger, the young salesman, and wondered if he, too, would leave. Daily he fancied slights. He noted that he was not asked to speak at the annual Chamber of Commerce dinner. When Orville Jones gave a large poker party and he was not invited, he was certain that he had been snubbed. He was afraid to go to lunch at the athletic club and afraid not to go. He believed that he was spied on, that when he left the table they whispered about him. Everywhere he heard the rustling whispers, in the offices of clients, in the bank when he made a deposit, in his own office, in his own home. Interminably he wondered what they were saying of him. All day long in imaginary conversations he caught them marveling.
"Babbitt? Why, say, he's a regular anarchist. You got to admire the fellow for his nerve, the way he turned liberal, and, by golly, just absolutely runs his life to suit himself. But say, he's dangerous. That's what he is. And he's got to be shown up."
He was so twitchy that when he rounded a corner and chanced on 2 acquaintances talking, whispering, his heart leaped, and he stalked by like an embarrassed schoolboy. When he saw his neighbors, Howard Littlefield and Orville Jones, together, he peered at them, went indoors to escape their spying, and was miserably certain that they had been whispering, plotting, whispering. Through all his fear ran defiance. He felt stubborn. Sometimes he decided that he had been a very devil of a fellow, as bold as Seneca Doane. Sometimes he planned to call on Doane and tell him what a revolutionist he was. He never got beyond the planning. But just as often, when he heard the soft whispers enveloping him, he wailed,
"Good Lord, what have I done? Just played with a bunch and called down Clara's drum about being such a high and mighty sodger. Never catch me criticizing people and trying to make them accept my ideas."
He could not stand the strain. Before long he admitted that he would like to flee back to the security of conformity, provided there was a decent and credible way to return. But stubbornly he would not be forced back. He would not, he swore, eat dirt. Only in spirited engagements with his wife did these turbulent fears rise to the surface. She complained that he seemed nervous, that she couldn't understand why he did not want to drop in at the Littlefields for the evening. He tried, but he could not express to her the nebulous facts of his rebellion and punishment. And, with Paul and Tanis lost, he had no one to whom he could talk. "Good Lord, Tinka is the only real friend I have these days." He sighed, and he clung to the child, played floor games with her all evening. He considered going to see Paul in prison, but though he had a pale, curt note from him every week, he thought of Paul as dead. It was Tanis for whom he was longing. "I thought I was so smart and independent, cutting Tanis out, and I need her. Lord, how I need her," he raged. "Myra simply can't understand. All she sees in life is getting along by being just like other folks. But Tanis, she'd tell me I was all right." Then he broke, and one evening late he did run to Tanis. He had not dared to hope for it, but she was in, and alone. Only she wasn't Tanis. She was a courteous, bow-lifting, ice-armored woman who looked like Tanis. She said, "Yes, George? What is it?" in even and uninterested tones, and he crept away whipped. His first comfort was from Ted and Eunice Littlefield. They danced in one evening when Ted was home from the university, and Ted chuckled, "What's this I hear from Eunie, Dad? She says her dad says you raised Cain by boosting old Seneca Doane. Hot dog, give 'em fits, stir 'em up. This old Berg is asleep." Eunice plumped down on Babbitt's lap, kissed him, nestled her bobbed hair against his chin, and crowed, "I think you're lots nicer than Howard. Why is it," confidentially, "that Howard is such an old grouch? The man is a good heart, and honestly, he's awfully bright, but he never will learn to step on the gas, after all the training I've given him. Don't you think we could do something with him, dearest?"
"Why, Eunice, that isn't a nice way to speak of your papa,"
Babbitt observed in the best Floral Heights manner. But he was happy for the first time in weeks. He pictured himself as the veteran liberal, strengthened by the loyalty of the young generation. They went out to rifle the icebox. Babbitt gloated, "If your mother caught us at this, we'd certainly get our comeuppance." And Eunice became maternal, scrambled a terrifying number of eggs for them, kissed Babbitt on the ear, and, in the voice of a brooding abyss, marveled, "It beats the devil why feminists like me go on nursing these men." Thus stimulated, Babbitt was reckless when he encountered Sheldon Smeeth, educational director of the YMCA and choir leader of the Chatham Road Church. With one of his damp hands, Smeeth imprisoned Babbitt's thick paw. While he chatted, "Brother Babbitt, we haven't seen you at church very often lately. I know you're busy with a multitude of details, but you mustn't forget your good friends at the old church home." Babbitt shook off the affectionate clasp. Sheldy liked to hold hands for a long time, and snarled, "Well, I guess you fellows can run the show without me. Sorry, Smeeth. Gotta beat it. Good day." But afterward he winced. If that white worm had the nerve to try to drag me back to the old church home, then the holy outfit must have been doing a lot of talking about me, too. He heard them whispering. Dr. John Jennison Drew, Chimaldi Frink, even William Washington Earthorne. The independence seeped out of him, and he walked the streets alone, afraid of men's cynical eyes and the incessant hiss of whispering. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt, by Sinclair Lewis. Chapter 33. 1. He tried to explain to his wife, as they prepared for bed, how objectionable was Sheldon Smeeth, but all her answer was, "He has such a beautiful voice, so spiritual. I don't think you ought to speak of him like that just because you can't appreciate music." He saw her then as a stranger. He stared bleakly at this plump and fussy woman with the broad bare arms, and wondered how she had ever come here. In his chilly cot, turning from aching side to side, He pondered of Tanis.
He'd been a fool to lose her. He had to have somebody he could really talk to. He'd bust if he went on stewing about things by himself. And Myra, useless to expect her to understand. Well, rats, no use dodging the issue. Damn shame for two married people to drift apart after all these years. Darn rotten shame. But nothing could bring them together now, as long as he refused to let Zenith bully him into taking orders. And he was, by golly, not going to let anybody bullying him into anything, or wheedle him, or coax him either. He woke at 3, roused by a passing motor, and struggled out of bed for a drink of water. As he passed through the bedroom, he heard his wife groan. His resentment was night-blurred. He was solicitous in inquiring, "What's trouble, hon?" "I got such a pain down here on my side. It tears at me." "Bad indigestion? Shall I get you some bicarb?"
"Don't think that would help. I felt funny last evening and yesterday, and then it passed away, and I got to sleep, and that auto woke me up." Her voice was laboring like a ship in a storm. He was alarmed.
I better call the doctor."
No, it'll go away. But maybe you might give me an ice bag." He stalked to the bathroom for the ice bag, down to the kitchen for ice. He felt dramatic in this late-night expedition, but as he gouged the chunk of ice with the dagger-like pick, he was cool, steady, mature. And the old friendliness was in his voice as he patted the ice bag into place on her groin, rumbling, There, that'll be better now." He retired to bed, but he did not sleep. He heard her groan again. Instantly he was up, soothing her. "Still pretty bad, honey?" "Yes, it just grips me, and I can't get to sleep." Her voice was faint. He knew her dread of doctors' verdicts, and he did not inform her, but he creaked downstairs, telephoned to Dr. Earl Patten, and waited shivering, trying with fuzzy eyes to read a magazine, till he heard the doctor's car. The doctor was youngish and professionally breezy. He came in as though it were sunny noontime. "Well, George, little trouble, eh? How is she now?" he said busily, as, with tremendous and rather irritating cheerfulness, he tossed his coat on a chair and warmed his hands at a radiator. He took charge of the house. Babbitt felt ousted and unimportant as he followed the doctor up to the bedroom, and it was the doctor who chuckled, "Oh, just a little stomach ache," when Verona peeped through her door, begging, "What is it, Dad? What is it?" To Mrs. Babbitt the doctor said with amiable belligerence after his examination, "Kind of a bad old pain, eh? I'll give you something to make you sleep, and I think you'll feel better in the morning. I'll come in right after breakfast." But to Babbitt, laying in wait in the lower hall, the doctor sighed, "I don't like the feeling there in her belly. There's some rigidity and some inflammation. She's never had her appendix out, has she? Well, no use worrying. I'll be here first thing in the morning, and meantime she'll get some rest. I give her a hypo. Good night." Then was Babbitt caught up in the black tempest. Instantly all the indignations which had been dominating him and the spiritual dramas through which he had struggled became pallid and absurd before the ancient and overwhelming realities, the standard and traditional realities of sickness and menacing death, the long night, and the thousand steadfast implications of married life. He crept back to her as she drowsed away in the tropic languor of morphia. He sat on the edge of her bed, holding her hand, and for the first time in many weeks her hand abode trustfully in his. He draped himself grotesquely in his toweling bathrobe and a pink and white couch cover, and sat lumpishly in a wing chair. The bedroom was uncanny in its half-light, which turned the curtains to lurking robbers, the dressing-table to a turreted castle. It smelled of cosmetics, of linen, of sleep. He napped and woke 100 times. He heard her move and sigh in slumber. He wondered if there wasn't some officious, brisk thing he could do for her. And before he could quite form the thought, he was asleep, racked and aching. The night was infinite. When dawn came and the waiting seemed at an end, he fell asleep, and was vexed to have been caught off guard, to have been aroused by Verona's entrance and her agitated, "Oh, what is it, Dad?" His wife was awake, her face sallow and lifeless in the morning light. But now he did not compare her with Tanis. She was not merely a woman, to be contrasted with other women, but his own self, and though he might criticize her and nag her, it was only as he might criticize and nag himself, interestedly, unpatronizingly, without the expectation of changing, or any real desire to change. The eternal essence. With Verona he sounded fatherly again and firm. He consoled Tinka, who satisfactorily pointed the excitement of the hour by wailing. He ordered early breakfast and wanted to look at the newspaper, and felt somehow heroic and useful in not looking at it. But there was still crawling and totally unheroic hours of waiting before Dr. Patten returned. "Don't see much change," said Patten. "I'll be back about 11, and if you don't mind, I think I'll bring some other world-famous pill peddler for consultation, just to be on the safe side. Now, George, there's nothing you can do. I'll have Verona keep the ice bag filled. Might as well leave that on, I guess. And you better beat it to the office instead of standing around here looking as if you were the patient. The nerve of husbands! Lot more neurotic than women. They always have to horn in and get all the credit for feeling bad when their wives are ailing. Now have another nice cup of coffee and get." Under this derision Babbitt became more matter-of-fact. He drove to the office, tried to dictate letters, tried to telephone, and before the call was answered forgot to whom he was telephoning. At 10:15 he returned home. As he left the downtown traffic and sped up the car, his face was as grimly creased as the mask of tragedy. His wife greeted him with surprise. "Why did you come back, dear? I think I feel a little better. I told Verona to skip off to her office. Was it wicked of me to go and get sick?" He knew that she wanted petting, and she got it, joyously. They were curiously happy when he heard Dr. Patten's car in front. He looked out of the window. He was frightened. With Patten was an impatient man with turbulent black hair and a hussar mustache, Dr. A.I. Dilling, the surgeon. Babbitt sputtered with anxiety, tried to conceal it, and hurried down to the door. Dr. Patten was profusely casual. "Don't want to worry you, old man, but I thought it might be a good stunt to have Dr. Dilling examine her." He gestured toward Dilling as toward a master. Dilling nodded in his curtest manner and strode upstairs. Babbitt tramped the living room in agony. Except for his wife's confinements, there had never been a major operation in the family, and to him surgery was at once a miracle and an abomination of fear. But when Dilling and Patten came down again, he knew that everything was all right, and he wanted to laugh, for the two doctors were exactly like the bearded physicians in a musical comedy, both of them rubbing their hands and looking foolishly sagacious. Dr. Dilling spoke. "I'm sorry, old man, but it's acute appendicitis. We ought to operate. Of course, you must decide, but there's no question as to what has to be done." Babbitt did not get all the force of it. He mumbled, "Well, I suppose we get her ready in a couple of days. Probably Ted ought to come down from the university just in case anything happened." Dr. Dilling growled, "Nope. If you don't want peritonitis to set in, we have got to operate right away. I must advise it strongly. If you say go ahead, I'll phone for the St. Mary's ambulance at once, and we'll have her on the table in 3/4 of an hour." Of course, I suppose you know what, but great God, man, I can't get her clothes ready and everything in 2 seconds, you know, and in her state, so wrought up and weak." "Just throw her hairbrush and comb and toothbrush in a bag. That's all she'll need for a day or two," said Dr. Dilling, and went to the telephone. Babbitt galloped desperately upstairs. He sent the frightened Tinka out of the room.
he said gaily to his wife, "Well, the doc thinks maybe we better have a little operation and get it over. Just take a few minutes, not half as serious as a confinement, and you'll be all right in a jiffy." She gripped his hand till the fingers ached. She said patiently, like a coward child, "I'm afraid to go into the dark all alone." Maturity was wiped from her eyes. They were pleading and terrified. "Will you stay with me? Darling, you don't have to go to the office now, do you? Could you just go down to the hospital with me? Could you come see me this evening, if everything's all right? You won't have to go out this evening, will you?" He was on his knees by the bed. While she feebly ruffled his hair, he sobbed. He kissed the lawn of her sleeve and swore, "Oh, honey, I love you more than anything in the world. I've kind of been worried by business and everything, but that's all over now, and I'm back again." "Are you really, Georgie? I was thinking lying here, maybe it would be a good thing if I just went. I was wondering if anybody really needed me or wanted me. I was wondering what was the use of my living. I've been getting so stupid and ugly." "Why, you old humbug, fishing for compliments when I ought to be packing your bag. Me, sure. I'm young and handsome and a regular village cut-up and—" He could not go on. He sobbed again, and in muttered incoherencies they found each other. As he packed, his brain was curiously clear and swift. He'd have no more wild evenings, he realized. He admitted that he would regret them. A little grimly he perceived that this had been his last aspiring fling before the paralyzed contentment of middle age. Well, and he grinned impishly, it was one doggone good party while it lasted. And how much was the operation going to cost? I ought to have fought that out with Dilling, but no, damn it, I don't care how much it cost. The motor ambulance was at the door. Even in his grief, the Babbitt who admired all technical excellences was interested in the kindly skill with which the attendants slid Mrs. Babbitt upon a stretcher and carried her downstairs. The ambulance was a huge, suave, varnished white thing. Mrs. Babbitt moaned, "It frightens me. It's just like a hearse. Just like being put in a hearse. I want you to stay with me." "I'll be right up front with the driver," Babbitt promised. "Oh, I want you to stay inside with me." To the attendants, "Can't he be inside?" "Sure, ma'am, you bet. There's a fine little camp stool in there," the older attendant said with professional pride. He sat beside her in the traveling cabin with its cot, its stool, its active little electric radiator, and its quite unexplained calendar displaying a girl eating cherries and the name of an enterprising grocer. But as he flung out his hand in hopeless cheerfulness, it touched the radiator, and he squealed, "Oh, Jesus!" "Why, George Babbitt, I won't have you cursing and swearing and blaspheming." "I know, awful sorry, but gosh, all fish hooks! Look how I burned my hand. Gee whiz, it hurts like mischief. Why, that damn radiator is it's hotter than the hinges of Hades. Look, you can see a mark." So, as they drove up to St. Mary's Hospital, with the nurses already laying out the instruments for an operation to save her life, it was she who consoled him and kissed the place to make it well. And though he tried to be gruff and mature, he yielded to her and was glad to be babied. The ambulance whirled under the hooded carriage entrance of the hospital, and instantly he was reduced to a zero in the nightmare succession of cork-floored halls, endless doors, open, an old woman sitting up in a bed, an elevator, an anesthetizing room, a young interne contemptuous of husbands. He was permitted to kiss his wife. He saw a thin, dark nurse fit the cone over her mouth and nose. He stiffened at a sweet and treacherous odor. Then he was driven out, and on a high stool in a laboratory he sat dazed, longing to see her once again, to insist that he had always loved her, had never for a second loved anybody else or looked at anybody else. In the laboratory he was conscious only of a decayed object preserved in a bottle of yellowing alcohol. It made him very sick, but he could not take his eyes from it.
He was more aware of it than of waiting. His mind floated in abeyance, coming back always to that horrible bottle. To escape it, he opened the door to the right, hoping to find a sane and businesslike office. He realized that he was looking into the operating room. In one glance he took in Dr. Dilling, strange in white gown and bandaged head, bending over the steel table with its screws and wheels. Then nurses holding basins and cotton sponges, and the swathed thing, just a lifeless chin and a mound of white in the midst of which was a square of sallow flesh with a gash a little bloody on the edges, protruding from the gash a cluster of forceps like clinging parasites. He shut the door with haste. It may be that his frightened repentance of the night and morning had not eaten in, but this dehumanizing interment of her who had been so pathetically human shook him utterly, and as he crouched again on the high stool in the laboratory he swore faith to his wife, to Zenith, to business efficiency, to the Boosters Club, to every faith of the clan of good fellows. Then a nurse was soothing, "All over. Perfect success. She'll come out fine. She'll be out from under anesthetic soon, and you can see her." He found her on a curious tilted bed, her face an unwholesome yellow, but her purple lips moving slightly. Then only did he really believe that she was alive. She was muttering. He bent and heard her sighing, "Hard to get real maple syrup for pancakes." He laughed inexhaustibly. He beamed on the nurse and proudly confided, "Think of her talking about maple syrup. By golly, I'm going to go and order 100 gallons of it, right from Vermont." 2. She was out of the hospital in 17 days. He went to see her each afternoon, and in their long talks they drifted back to intimacy. Once he hit on something of his relations to Tanis and the Bunch, and she was inflated by the view that a wicked woman had captivated her poor George. If once he had doubted his neighbors and the supreme charm of the good fellows, he was convinced now. "You didn't," he noted, "see Seneca Doane coming around with any flowers or dropping in to chat with the missus." But Mrs. Howard Littlefield brought to the hospital her priceless wine jelly, flavored with real wine. Orville Jones spent hours in picking out the kind of novels Mrs. Babbitt liked. Nice love stories about New York millionaires and Wyoming cowpunchers. Louetta Swanson knitted a pink bed jacket. Sidney Finkelstein and his merry brown-eyed flapper of a wife selected the prettiest nightgown in all the stock of Parcher and Stein. All his friends ceased whispering about him, suspecting him. At the athletic club they asked after her daily. Club members whose names he did not know stopped him to inquire, "How's your good lady getting on?" Babbitt felt that he was swinging from bleak uplands down into the rich warm air of a valley, pleasant with cottages. One noon Vergil Gunch suggested, "You planning to go to the hospital about 6? The wife and I thought we'd drop in." They did drop in. Gunch was so humorous that Mrs. Babbitt said he must stop making her laugh, because, honestly, it was hurting her incision. As they passed down the hall, Gunch demanded amiably, "George, old scout, you were sore-headed about something here a while back. I don't know why, and it's none of my business, but you seem to be feeling all hunky-dory again, and why don't you come join us in the Good Citizens League, old man? We have some corking times together, and we need your advice." Then did Babbitt, almost tearful with joy at being coaxed instead of bullied, at being permitted to stop fighting, at being able to desert without injuring his opinion of himself, cease utterly to be a domestic revolutionist. He patted Gunch's shoulder, and next day he became a member of the Good Citizens League. Within 2 weeks, no one in the league was more violent regarding the wickedness of Seneca Doane, the crimes of labor unions, the perils of immigration, and the delights of golf, morality, and bank accounts than was George F. Babbitt. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Babbitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 34. 1. The Good Citizens League had spread through the country, but nowhere was it so effective and well esteemed as in the cities of the type of Zenith, commercial cities of a few 100,000 inhabitants, most of which, though not all, lay inland against a background of cornfields and mines, and of small towns which depended upon them for mortgage loans, table manners, art, social philosophy, and millinery. To the League belonged most of the prosperous citizens of Zenith. They were not all of the kind who called themselves regular guys. Besides these hardy fellows, these salesmen of prosperity, there were the aristocrats, that is, the men who were richer or had been rich for more generations, the presidents of banks and of factories, the landowners, the corporation lawyers, the fashionable doctors, and the few young old men who worked not at all, but reluctantly remaining in Zenith, collected lustreware and first editions as though they were back in Paris. All of them agreed that the working classes must be kept in their place, and all of them perceived that American democracy did not imply any equality of wealth, but did demand a wholesome sameness of thought, dress, painting, morals, and vocabulary. In this they were like the ruling class of any other country, particularly of Great Britain, but they differed in being more vigorous and in actually trying to produce the accepted standards which all classes everywhere desire but usually despair in realizing. The longest struggle of the Good Citizens League was against the open shop, which was secretly a struggle against all union labor. Accompanying it was an Americanization movement, with evening classes in English and history and economics, and daily articles in the newspapers, so that newly arrived foreigners might learn that the true blue and 100% American way of settling labor troubles was for workmen to trust and love their employers. The League was more than generous in approving other organizations which agreed with its aims. It helped the YMCA to raise a $200,000 fund for a new building. Babbitt, Virgil Gunch, Sidney Finkelstein, and even Charles McKelvey told the spectators at movie theaters how great an influence for manly Christianity the good old Y had been in their own lives, and the hoar and mighty Colonel Redford Snow, owner of the Advocate-Times, was photographed clasping the hands of Sheldon Smeeth of the YMCA. It is true that afterwards, when Smeeth lisped, "You must come to one of our prayer meetings," the ferocious colonel bellowed, "What the hell would I do that for? Got a bar of my own." But this did not appear in the public prints. The League was of value to the American Legion at a time when certain of the lesser and looser newspapers were criticizing that organization of veterans of the Great War. One evening a number of young men raided the Zenith Socialist headquarters, burned its records, beat the office staff, and agreeably dumped desks out of the window. All the newspapers, save the Advocate-Times and the Evening Advocate, attributed this valuable but perhaps hasty direct action to the American Legion. Then a flying squadron from the Good Citizens League called on the unfair papers and explained that no ex-soldier could possibly do such a thing, and the editors saw the light and retained their advertising. When Zenith's lone conscientious objector came home from prison and was righteously run out of town, the newspapers referred to the perpetrators as an unidentified mob. 2. In all the activities and triumphs of the Good Citizens League Babbitt took part, and completely won back to self-respect, placidity, and the affection of his friends. But he began to protest. "Gosh, I've done my share in cleaning up the city. I want to tend to business. Think I'll just kind of slacken up on this GCL stuff now." He had returned to the church as he had returned to the Boosters' Club. He had even endured the lavish greeting which Sheldon Smeeth gave him. He was worried lest during his late discontent he had imperiled his salvation. He was not quite sure there was a heaven to be attained, but Dr. John Jennison Drew said there was, and Babbitt was not going to take a chance. One evening, when he was walking past Dr. Drew's parsonage, he impulsively went in and found the pastor in his study. "Just a minute, getting a phone call," said Dr. Drew in businesslike tones, then aggressively to the telephone. "Hello? Hello? This Berkeley and Hannis? Reverend Drew speaking. Where the dickens is the proof for next Sunday's calendar? Huh? You ought to have it here. Well, I can't help it. They're all sick. I've got to have it tonight. Get an ADT, boy, and shoot it up here quick." He turned without slacking his briskness. "Well, Brother Babbitt, what can I do for you?" "I just want to ask, tell you how it is. Dominie, there a while ago I guess I got kind of slack. Took a few drinks and so on. What I wanted to ask is, how is it if a fellow cuts that all out and comes back to his senses? Does it sort of, well, you might say, does it score against him in the long run?" The Reverend Drew was suddenly interested. "And, brother, what other things, too? Women?" "No, practically, you might say, practically not at all." "Don't hesitate to tell me, brother. That's what I'm here for. Been going on joy rides, squeezing girls in cars?" The Reverend's eyes glistened. "No, no." "Well, I'll tell you. I've got a deputation from the Don't Make Prohibition a Joke Association coming to see me in a quarter of an hour, and one from the Anti-Birth Control Union at a quarter of 10. He busily glanced at his watch. "But I can take 5 minutes off and pray with you. Kneel right down by your chair, brother. Don't be ashamed to seek the guidance of God." Babbitt's scalp itched, and he longed to flee, but Dr. Drew had already flopped down beside his desk chair, and his voice had changed from rasping efficiency to an uncourteous familiarity with sin and with the Almighty. Babbitt also knelt, while Drew gloated. "O Lord, Thou seest our brother here, who has been led astray by manifold temptations. O Heavenly Father, make his heart to be pure as a little child's. O let him know again the joy of a manly courage to abstain from evil." Sheldon Smeeth came flockering into the study. At the sight of the two men he smirked forgivingly, patted Babbitt on the shoulder, and knelt beside him, his arm about him, while he authorized Dr. Drew's imprecations with moans of, "Yes, Lord, help our brother, Lord." Though he was trying to keep his eyes closed, Babbitt squinted between his fingers and saw the pastor glance at his watch, as he concluded with a triumphant, "And let him never be afraid to come to us for counsel and tender care, and let him know that the church can lead him as a little lamb." Dr. Drew sprang up, rolled his eyes in the general direction of heaven, chucked his watch into his pocket, and demanded, "Has the deputation come yet, Sheldy?" "Yep, right outside," Sheldy answered, with equivocal liveliness. Then caressingly to Babbitt, "Brother, if it would help, I'd love to go into the next room and pray with you while Dr. Drew is receiving the brothers from the Don't Make a Prohibition a Joke Association." "No, thanks, I can't take the time," yelped Babbitt, rushing toward the door. Thereafter he was often seen at the Catham Road Presbyterian Church, but it is recorded that he avoided shaking hands with the pastor at the door. 3. If his moral fiber had been so weakened by rebellion that he was not quite dependable in the more rigorous campaigns of the Good Citizens League, nor quite appreciative of the church, yet there was no doubt of the joy with which Babbitt returned to the pleasures of his home and of the athletic club, the Boosters and Elks. Verona and Kenneth Escott were eventually and hesitatingly married. For the wedding, Babbitt was dressed as carefully as was Verona. He was crammed into the morning coat he wore to teas thrice a year, and with a certain relief, after Verona and Kenneth had driven away in a limousine, he returned to the house, removed the morning coat, sat with his aching feet up on a davenport, and reflected that his wife and he could have the living-room to themselves now, and not have to listen to Verona and Kenneth worrying in a cultured, collegiate manner about minimum wages and the Drama League. But even this sinking into peace was less consoling than his return to being one of the best-loved men in the Boosters Club. 4. President Willis Ijams began the Boosters Club luncheon by standing quiet and staring at them so unhappily that they feared he was about to announce the death of a brother Booster. He spoke slowly then and gravely. "Boys, I have something shocking to reveal to you. Something terrible about one of our own members." Several Boosters, including Babbitt, looked a little disconcerted. "A knight of the grip, a trusted friend of mine, recently made a trip upstate, and in a certain town where a certain Booster spent his boyhood, he found out something which can no longer be concealed. In fact, he discovered the inward nature of a man whom we have accepted as a real guy and one of us. Gentlemen, I cannot trust my voice to say it, so I've written it down." He uncovered a large blackboard, and on it in huge capitals was the legend, "George Philonous B. Babbitt. Oh, you folly!" The Boosters cheered, they laughed, they wept, they threw rolls at Babbitt, they cried, "Speech! Speech! Oh, you folly!" President Ijams continued, "That, gentlemen, is the awful thing Georgie Babbitt has been concealing all these years, when we thought he was just plain George F. Now, I want you to tell us, talking in turn, what you've always supposed the F stood for." "Flivver," they suggested, and frog face, and flathead, and financius, and freezone, and flappadoodle, and foghorn. By joviality of their insults, Babbitt knew that he had been taken back to their hearts, and happily he rose. "Boys, I've got to admit it. I've never worn a wristwatch or parted my name in the middle. But I will confess to Follinsby. My only justification is that my old dad, though otherwise he was perfectly sane and packed an awful wallop when it came to trimming the city fathers at checkers, named me after the family doc, old Doc Ambrose Follinsby. I apologize, boys. In my next what-do-you-call-it, I'll see to it that I get named something really practical, something that sounds swell and yet is good and virile, something, in fact, like that grand old name so familiar to every household, that bold and almost overpowering name, Willis Jimmy Jams Ijams." He knew by the cheer that he was secure again and popular. He knew that he would no more endanger his security and popularity by straying from the clan of good fellows. 5. Henry Thompson dashed into the office clamoring, "Georgie, big news! Jake Offutt says the Traction Bunch are dissatisfied with the way Sanders, Torrey, and Wing handled their last deal, and they're willing to dicker with us." Babbitt was pleased in the realization that the last scar of his rebellion was healed. Yet as he drove home he was annoyed by such background thought as had never weakened him in his days of belligerent conformity. He discovered that he actually did not consider the Traction Group quite honest. Well, he'd carry out one more deal for them, but as soon as it was practicable, maybe as soon as old Henry Thompson died, he'd break away from all association from them. He was 48. In 12 years he'd be 60. He wanted to leave a clean business to his grandchildren. Of course, there was a lot of money in negotiating for the Traction people, and a fellow had to look at things in a practical way, only he wiggled uncomfortably. He wanted to tell the Traction Group what he thought of them. Oh, he couldn't do it. Not now. If he offended them this second time, they would crush him. But he was conscious that his line of progress seemed confused. He wondered what he would do with his future. He was still young. Was he through with all adventuring? He felt that he had been trapped into the very net from which he had with such fury escaped, and, supremest jest of all, been made to rejoice in the trapping. "They've licked me to a finish," he whimpered. The house was peaceful that evening, and he enjoyed a game of pinochle with his wife. He indignantly told a tempter that he was content to do things in the good old-fashioned way. The day after, he went to see the purchasing agent of the Street Traction Company, and they made plans for the secret purchase of lots along the Evanston Road. But as he drove to his office, he struggled. "I'm going to run things and figure out things to suit myself when I retire." 6. Ted had come down from the university for the weekend. Though he no longer spoke of mechanical engineering, and though he was reticent about his opinion of his instructors, he seemed no more reconciled to college, and his chief interest was his wireless telephone set. On Saturday evening he took Eunice Littlefield to a dance at Devon Woods. Babbitt had a glimpse of her, bouncing in the seat of the car, brilliant in a scarlet cloak over a frock of thinnest creamy silk. They, too, had not returned when the Babbitts went to bed. At 11:30, at a blurred, indefinite time of late night, Babbitt was awakened by the ring of the telephone and gloomily crawled downstairs. Howard Littlefield was speaking. "George, Emmy isn't back yet. Is Ted?" "No, at least his door is open." "They ought to be home. Eunice said the dance would be over at midnight. What's the name of those people where they're going?" "Well, gosh, tell the truth, I don't know, Howard. It's some classmate of Ted's out in Devon Woods. Don't see what we can do. Wait, I'll skip up and ask Mary if she knows their name." Babbitt turned on the light in Ted's room. It was a brown, boyish room. Disordered dresser, worn books, a high school pennant, photographs of basketball teams and baseball teams. Ted was decidedly not there. Mrs. Babbitt, awakened irritably, observed that she certainly did not know the name of Ted's host, that it was late, that Howard Littlefield was but little better than a born fool, and that she was sleepy. But she remained awake and worrying, while Babbitt, on the sleeping porch, struggled back into sleep through the incessant, soft rain of her remarks. It was after dawn when he was aroused by her shaking him and calling her, "George! George!" in something like horror. "Oh, what is it?" "Come here quick and see. Be quiet." She led him down the hall to the door of Ted's room and pushed it gently open. On the worn brown rug she saw a fourth of rose-colored chiffon lingerie on the sedate Morris chair, a girl's silver slipper, and on the pillows were two sleepy heads, Ted's and Eunice's. Ted woke to grin and mutter with unconvincing defiance, "Good morning. Let me introduce my wife, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt Eunice Littlefield Babbitt, Esquiress." "Good God!" from Babbitt, and from his wife a long wailing, "Oh, you've gone in." "We got married last evening. Wife, sit up and say pretty good morning to mother-in-law." But Eunice hid her shoulders and her charming wild hair under the pillow. By 9 o'clock the assembly which was gathered about Ted and Eunice in the living room included Mr. and Mrs. George Babbitt, Dr. and Mrs. Howard Littlefield, Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Escott, Mr. and Mrs. Henry T. Thompson, and Tinka Babbitt, who was the only pleased member of the Inquisition. A crackling shower of phrases filled the room. "At their age, ought to be annulled. Never heard of such a thing." "Fault of both of them." "Keep it out of the papers." "Ought to be packed off to school." "Do something about it at once." "And what I say is, damn good old-fashioned spanking." Worst of them all was Verona. "Dad!" "Some way must be found to make you understand how dreadfully serious this is, instead of standing around with that silly, foolish smile on your face." He began to revolt. "Willikers, Ron, you got married yourself, didn't you?" "That's entirely different." "You bet it is. They didn't have to work on you and me with a chain and tackle to get us to hold hands." "Now, young man, we'll have no more flippancy," old Henry Thompson ordered. "You listen to me." "You listen to grandfather," said Verona. "You listen to your grandfather," said Mrs. Babbitt. "Ted, you listen to Mr. Thompson," said Howard Littlefield. "Oh, for the love of Mike, I am listening!" Ted shouted. "But you look here, all of you. I'm getting sick and tired of being the corpse in this post-mortem. If you want to kill somebody, go kill the preacher that married us. Why, he stung me $5, and all the money I had in the world was $6 and 2 bits. I'm getting just about enough of being hollered at."
A new voice, booming, authoritative, dominated the room. It was Babbitt. "Yep, there's too darn many putting in their oar. Rone, you dry up. Howard and I are still pretty strong and able to do our own cussing. Ted, come into the dining room and we'll talk this over."
In the dining room, the door firmly closed, Babbitt walked to his son, put both hands on his shoulders.
"You're more or less right. They all talk too much. Now what do you plan to do, old man?"
"Gosh, Dad, are you really going to be human?"
"Well, I remember one time you called us the Babbitt men and said we ought to stick together. I want to. I don't pretend to think this isn't serious, the way the cards are stacked against a young fellow today. I can't say I approve of early marriages, but you couldn't have married a better girl than Eunice. And way I figure it, Littlefield is darn lucky to get a Babbitt for a son-in-law. But what do you plan to do? Of course, you could go right ahead with the U, and when you finished—"
"Dad, I can't stand it any more. Maybe it's all right for some fellows. Maybe I'll want to go back some day. But me, I want to get into mechanics. I think I'll get to be a good inventor. There's a fellow that would give me $20 a week in a factory right now."
"Well,"
Babbitt crossed the floor slowly, ponderously, seeming a little old.
"I've always wanted you to have a college degree." He meditatively stomped across the floor again. "But I've never— now for heaven's sake, don't repeat this to your mother or she'd remove what little hair I got left— but practically, I've never done a single thing I've wanted to in my whole life. I don't know as I've accomplished anything except just get along. Figure out I've made about a quarter of an inch out of a possible 100 rods. Well, maybe you'll carry things on further. I don't know. But I do get kind of a sneaking pleasure out of the fact that you know what you want to do, and you did it. Well, those folks in there will try to bully you and tame you down. Tell 'em to go to the devil. I'll back you. Take your factory job if you want to. Don't be scared of the family. No, nor all of Zenith, nor of yourself, the way I've been. Go ahead, old man. World is yours."
Arms about each other's shoulders, the Babbitt men marched into the living room and faced the swooping family. End of Chapter 34. Recording by Mike Vendetti, Canyon City, Colorado. MikeVendetti.com. End of Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis.